The night air above the Nile was cool before sunrise. Long before the heat arrived over the desert, before the fishermen pushed their small reed boats into the dark water, before workers lifted baskets onto tired shoulders, ancient Egypt rested in silence beneath a sky filled with slow and distant stars. The villages along the Nile still slept. Mud brick homes stood quietly beside narrow dirt paths. Palm leaves moved gently in the soft wind. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once and then disappeared back into the stillness of the night. Inside one small worker's home, a cooking fire had almost burned out. Only a faint orange glow remained beneath gray ash. The room smelled softly of smoke, grain, dust, and baked bread from the evening before. A man named Hori slowly opened his eyes. His sleeping mat rested close to the floor beside his wife and two children. The roof above him was flat and dark. Tiny pieces of straw stuck out from the mud walls around the room. For a few moments, he did not move. He simply listened. The quiet sound of wind outside. The soft breathing of his family. The distant movement of water against the shore of the Nile. Another workday was beginning. And like nearly every morning of his life, the first thoughts in his mind were not about kings or temples or pyramids. They were about food. Bread for the morning. Beer for the afternoon heat. Maybe onions if the storage basket still held enough. Maybe dried fish if the river had been generous the day before. Simple food. The same meals returned again and again through the years, almost unchanged, like the steady movement of the river itself. Far away, great monuments were rising beneath the Egyptian sun. Scribes carefully painted symbols across papyrus. Priests walked through temple halls filled with incense and shadow. But ordinary workers lived differently. Their world was smaller. Quieter. Closer to the earth. Their days were measured through hunger, labor, heat, rest, and meals shared slowly beside clay ovens at the end of long afternoons. And yet, without them, ancient Egypt could never have existed. The stones would not move. The canals would not open. The fields would not feed the cities. The temples would remain unfinished. History often remembers kings. But kingdoms survive because ordinary people wake before sunrise and eat enough food to continue another day. Tonight, the story moves gently toward those people. Toward the workers who carried limestone beneath burning skies. Toward the women who spent hours grinding grain into flour. Toward fishermen standing quietly beside morning water. Toward farmers walking through wet soil left behind by the Nile flood. Toward children chewing pieces of warm bread while sitting beside shaded walls. And slowly, almost quietly, the story moves toward the food itself. Because food shaped every hour of life in ancient Egypt. Bread was not simply bread. Beer was not simply drink. Even onions and garlic carried importance inside the daily rhythm of survival. The Nile River made all of it possible. Without the Nile, Egypt would only be desert. Beyond the green riverbanks stretched dry lands of sand and stone where little could grow. Heat shimmered across empty distances beneath pale skies. But beside the river, life gathered. Dark fertile soil spread across the land after yearly floodwaters slowly pulled away. Farmers planted barley and emmer wheat in moist earth while birds circled lazily overhead. The river carried fish. The fields produced grain. Palm trees offered shade and dates. Canals brought water across the land. Nearly every meal eaten by Egyptian workers began somewhere beside the Nile. Hori finally sat up from his mat. The room remained dark except for faint blue morning light entering through a small opening near the roof. His wife, Tia, was already awake beside the hearth. Without speaking loudly, she added dry reeds to the ashes. A small flame slowly returned. Tiny sparks floated upward into the dim room. This was how many mornings began in worker villages across Egypt. Not with loud conversations. Not with hurried movement. Everything moved slowly at first. The body needed time to wake before facing the heat outside. Tia reached toward a clay jar resting against the wall. Inside was ground grain prepared the evening before. Nearby sat another jar filled with water brought from the Nile. The grain was precious. Most worker families lived carefully with what they had. Grain was not wasted. Bread mattered too much for carelessness. For rich nobles, meals could include roasted duck, figs, honey cakes, wine, and fine meats prepared by servants. But for ordinary workers, meals stayed simple. Very simple. And usually, they repeated every day. Bread in the morning. Bread at midday. Bread in the evening. Beer beside the bread. Sometimes vegetables. Sometimes fish. Sometimes dates. Sometimes nothing more. Yet even these plain meals required enormous effort. Before sunrise each day, countless women across Egypt began grinding grain into flour using heavy grinding stones. The work was slow and exhausting. A woman knelt beside a flat stone while pushing another stone forward again and again over the grain. The motion repeated for hours. Back and forth. Back and forth. Back and forth. The sound filled villages every morning. A rough scraping sound. Soft but constant. Hands became rough from the work. Knees ached. Back stiffened beneath the heat. Still, the grain had to become flour. Without flour, there was no bread. Without bread, workers could not survive long days beneath the sun. Tia poured some grain onto the grinding stone. Outside, the sky slowly brightened. Birds began calling near the riverbanks. Somewhere nearby, another family opened their wooden door. A donkey snorted softly in the distance. The village was waking. As Tia worked, Hori stepped outside into the cool dawn air. The Nile rested quietly beyond the fields. Mist floated above the water in thin white lines while early sunlight slowly touched the eastern horizon. Palm trees stood dark against the growing light. Other workers were already awake. Some walked toward the river carrying jars for water. Others repaired sandals before the day began. A few men sat quietly eating pieces of bread from the night before. Nobody moved quickly yet. The hardest hours would come later, when the sun climbed high and heat pressed heavily against the land. For now, the world still felt gentle. Hori breathed deeply. The air smelled of wet soil, smoke, animals, and river water. This smell had followed him since childhood. He could not imagine another world beyond it. Like most workers, Hori did not travel far from the Nile villages during his life. The river shaped nearly everything he knew. Its floods decided whether food would be plentiful or scarce. Its fish filled cooking pots. Its water fed grain fields. Its currents carried boats north and south across Egypt. Even time itself seemed connected to the river. When floodwaters arrived, life changed. When they disappeared, planting began. When crops grew tall, workers prepared for harvest. The rhythm never truly stopped. And always, behind every season, stood food. A worker's strength depended on it. Large state building projects required thousands of laborers. Men hauling stone blocks beneath the Egyptian sun burned enormous energy every day. Without regular meals, their bodies would fail quickly. So rulers and overseers understood something very important. Workers had to eat. Bread and beer became part of payment systems across Egypt. Laborers often received measured amounts of grain which families then turned into food. In many ways, grain was wealth. It filled storage rooms. It paid workers. It survived long seasons if kept dry. It protected families during difficult times. A household with healthy grain storage felt safer than one without it. Back inside the home, the grinding continued. Tia mixed flour with water into rough dough. Her fingers moved carefully through the mixture while the small fire slowly warmed nearby. Their young son had awakened now. Still sleepy, he rubbed his eyes while watching his mother prepare the morning meal. Children in Egypt grew familiar with bread almost before anything else. They smelled it every day, touched flour every day, watched ovens glow every day. Bread was life. Some loaves were flat and round. Others were shaped into cones or thick rough pieces. Most were dense and heavy compared to modern bread. Tiny pieces of stone from grinding sometimes remained inside the flour, slowly wearing down teeth over the years. Many ancient Egyptian skeletons discovered by archaeologists show severe dental damage because of this. But workers continued eating the bread anyway. There was little choice. And despite its roughness, warm fresh bread brought comfort. Especially in the cool quiet hours before sunrise. Tia placed dough inside a simple clay oven. Soon the room filled with the smell of baking grain. Outside, sunlight slowly spread across the village paths. The day had begun. And like thousands of days before it, workers across ancient Egypt prepared themselves with the same simple foods that had carried generations through labor, heat, flood seasons, and long silent evenings beside the Nile. The story of kings would continue far away. But here, beside the river, ordinary people were waking slowly into another day of bread, beer, dust, and sunlight. The bread finished baking just as the first sunlight touched the tops of the palm trees. Warm air drifted through the small house as Tia carefully pulled the rough loaves from the clay oven using a folded cloth wrapped around her hands. The smell filled the room immediately. It was a deep, earthy smell. Simple. Heavy. Comforting. For families across ancient Egypt, this smell belonged to morning itself. Hori sat quietly beside the doorway while his children slowly gathered near the fire. Nobody spoke very much yet. The day still felt soft and half asleep. Outside, the village was growing louder little by little. Footsteps passed along dusty paths. A donkey brayed somewhere nearby. Clay jars knocked gently together as women returned from the river carrying water. From farther away came the faint sound of wooden boat poles touching the Nile. The world was waking carefully beneath the pale gold sky. Tia broke pieces from one of the warm loaves and handed them around the room. The bread was thick and coarse. Tiny bits of grain husk remained inside the crust. Hori chewed slowly. Breakfast was never large. Most workers could not afford huge meals before sunrise. Food had to last through the day. Grain supplies were watched carefully inside nearly every household. Still, even a small meal mattered. A laborer could not spend hours carrying stone beneath the Egyptian sun with an empty stomach. Beside the bread sat a clay jar filled with beer. Egyptian beer was very different from modern beer. It was thick, cloudy, and filled with bits of grain. Sometimes it looked almost like thin porridge. Children drank it. Workers drank it. Farmers drank it. Even many officials drank it daily. Clean water was not always easy to store safely, especially during hot seasons. Beer became an important part of everyday nutrition. It carried calories. It provided energy. And after long hours beneath the heat, it helped workers continue. Tia poured the beer carefully into small cups. The liquid smelled sour and grainy. Hori drank slowly while staring outside toward the brightening village road. Soon he would walk north toward a work site near the riverbank where laborers were repairing storage buildings damaged by last season's flood waters. The work would be slow and exhausting. Mud bricks needed shaping. Walls required lifting and rebuilding. Heavy baskets of wet clay would move constantly beneath the growing heat. By midday, the ground itself would seem to burn beneath bare feet and worn sandals. But for now, the coolness of morning still remained. The children finished eating first. Their daughter held the last piece of bread carefully, chewing slowly as sunlight reached across the floor of the house. Dust floated through the beams of light entering from the doorway. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. No overseers shouting. No burning heat. No aching muscles. Only the quiet beginning of another ordinary day. In many Egyptian homes, mornings looked almost exactly like this for generation after generation. The same ovens. The same grain. The same smoke-darkened walls. The same careful counting of food supplies. Life changed slowly for ordinary workers. Kings rose and disappeared. Dynasties shifted. Temples expanded beside the Nile. But daily meals remained surprisingly familiar across centuries. Bread and beer stood at the center of nearly everything. The grain used for bread usually came from emmer wheat or barley. Farmers worked hard during planting and harvest seasons to protect these crops because entire communities depended upon them. When the Nile flood waters finally retreated each year, rich dark soil remained behind. This was the beginning of intense labor. Farmers walked into the wet earth carrying wooden plows and baskets of seed. Oxen pulled slowly through the fields beneath wide skies filled with birds. The planting season demanded patience. Workers scattered grain carefully by hand while mud pressed between their toes. Water channels had to remain clear so fields could stay moist beneath the strong Egyptian sun. Every successful harvest mattered deeply. A poor harvest meant hunger. A failed flood season meant fear. Families watched the Nile closely because the river decided so much about survival. If floodwaters rose properly, crops often grew well. If waters remained too low, fields suffered. If flooding became too violent, homes and storage buildings could collapse. The river gave life, but it also demanded respect. Hori stood and prepared for work. His simple linen clothing hung loosely around his body. Years beneath the sun had darkened his skin and hardened his hands. Before leaving, he wrapped pieces of bread inside cloth to carry through the day. This was common among laborers. Midday meals were usually simple and portable. Workers often carried bread, onions, garlic, or dried fish to eat during short breaks. Sometimes they shared food together beneath small shaded areas beside work sites. Those brief moments of rest mattered greatly. A worker might sit on a stone block while sweat cooled across his shoulders. Nearby, another laborer opened a small basket filled with onions and coarse bread. Nobody expected luxury. Food was fuel. Comfort. Routine. And after hours of labor, even dry bread tasted satisfying. Outside, the village road now carried steady movement. Men walked toward fields carrying tools across their shoulders. Women swept dust from doorways. Children chased each other beside mud walls before beginning chores of their own. The sun climbed slowly higher. Its warmth spread gently at first across the earth. But everyone knew the fierce heat would arrive soon enough. Hori began walking beside several other workers heading toward the riverbank. Their pace was unhurried. The workday was long. there was no reason to waste energy early. As they moved through the village, the smells of morning drifted around them. Fresh bread, smoke from cooking fires, wet river mud, animals resting in shaded corners, crushed garlic, warm grain. These smells belonged to ordinary Egyptian life far more than perfumes from royal palaces ever did. The workers passed storage buildings filled with grain collected as taxes and payments. These structures were extremely important throughout Egypt. Grain storage protected communities during difficult seasons. Inside massive clay jars and granaries rested the food that kept workers alive. Officials carefully measured supplies while scribes recorded amounts on papyrus. In many ways, grain controlled the kingdom itself. A ruler who could feed workers maintained power. A ruler who failed risked unrest and suffering. Food was political even in ancient Egypt, though ordinary laborers rarely thought about it in those terms. For them, the concern was simpler. Would there be enough bread tomorrow? The group finally reached the riverbank. Morning light shimmered softly across the Nile. Small fishing boats drifted nearby while reeds moved in the wind. For a moment, the scene looked peaceful enough to belong inside a dream. But work began quickly. Supervisors directed laborers toward damaged walls where floodwaters had weakened mud bricks. Men carried baskets filled with clay while others shaped new bricks beneath the rising sun. The labor was repetitive. Lift. Walk. Place. Return. Again and again. Sweat soon covered their skin. By late morning, heat pressed heavily across the riverbank. Bright sunlight reflected from the water and sand, making the air feel almost blinding. Workers paused briefly beneath a shaded area made from cloth and wooden poles. This was the first meal break of the day. Hori sat carefully on the ground beside several other laborers. One man opened a basket holding onions and dried fish wrapped in cloth. Another passed around thick pieces of bread. The onions smelled sharp in the hot air. Garlic was common too. Egyptian workers valued onions and garlic not only for taste but also because they believed these foods helped maintain strength and health. Laborers building massive monuments often received onions, garlic, bread, and beer as part of their rations. Simple foods. Strong flavors. Enough to continue working beneath endless sunlight. Hori tore bread into smaller pieces and dipped it into a thick mixture of crushed beans another worker shared beside him. For a few minutes, conversation remained quiet and slow. Most men simply rested. The body needed stillness during the hottest hours. Far across the Nile, green fields shimmered beneath the sunlight while desert hills rose pale and silent in the distance. Egypt could feel beautiful and harsh at the same time. The river gave life. The sun gave harvests. But both demanded labor from ordinary people every single day. As Hori ate, he watched fishermen nearby pulling nets slowly through the water. Fish formed another important part of the Egyptian diet, especially for workers living near the Nile. Some fish were eaten fresh. Others were dried or salted for storage. Fishing happened constantly along the riverbanks. Men stood patiently in small boats while birds circled overhead. Nets slipped quietly through dark water. The smell of fish mixed with mud and sunlight. For poorer families, fish sometimes became the only source of protein available regularly. Meat from cattle or goats was expensive and uncommon for many workers. Ordinary laborers rarely enjoyed large meat meals except during festivals or special religious celebrations. Most days returned to the same familiar foods: bread, beer, onions, garlic, fish when available. And slowly, year after year, these meals shaped the bodies and routines of Egyptian workers beneath the endless skies beside the Nile. By the middle of the day, the heat settled heavily across the Nile Valley. The cool softness of morning had disappeared completely. Now the sunlight stood bright and white above the workers, pressing down upon mud walls, riverbanks, stone paths, and open fields with endless strength. Even the air itself seemed slower beneath the weight of the afternoon sun. Hori wiped sweat from his forehead and lifted another basket of wet clay onto his shoulder. The mud felt heavy. His muscles already ached from the long morning of labor, but the work continued steadily beside the riverbank. Around him, other workers moved slowly through the heat, their bodies covered in dust, sweat, and dried streaks of mud. Nobody wasted movement. Under the Egyptian sun, energy mattered too much. The overseers did not shout very often now. Even they understood the afternoon heat could drain strength from any man. Instead, the work site carried a quieter rhythm. Footsteps through dirt. Clay baskets being lowered onto the ground. Soft grunts from tired workers. The distant splash of river water. Birds calling somewhere beyond the reeds. The sounds blended together beneath the bright sky. In ancient Egypt, much of life depended on enduring heat like this. Farmers endured it in the fields. Builders endured it beside stone quarries. Fishermen endured it on the river. Women endured it while grinding grain near cooking fires. The sun fed Egypt's crops, but it also demanded patience from everyone who lived beside the Nile. Hori paused briefly near the shade cloth where workers rested during short breaks. His throat felt dry already. Nearby stood several large clay jars filled with beer. The jars were cool compared to the burning air outside. Moisture formed lightly along the clay surface as workers dipped cups into the thick drink. Egyptian beer was not clear or smooth. It contained grain pieces and sediment from brewing. Sometimes it tasted sour. Sometimes sweeter depending on how it had been prepared. Every household brewed it a little differently. Still, workers depended on it daily. A laborer might drink several portions throughout the day simply to maintain strength beneath the heat. Hori lifted a cup slowly. The beer tasted heavy and earthy. Warm grain lingered on his tongue while the liquid cooled his dry throat for a moment. Around him, other workers drank quietly while resting their tired legs. One older laborer sat against a mud wall chewing onions beside pieces of coarse bread. His face carried deep lines from years beneath the Egyptian sun. Beside him, another worker shared dried fish wrapped inside cloth. Meals at work sites often looked exactly like this. Nothing elaborate. Nothing luxurious. Just simple food eaten slowly between hours of labor. And yet these small meals carried enormous importance. Without enough bread and beer, work crews weakened quickly. Ancient Egyptian officials understood this very well. Records from workers' villages show careful organization of food supplies for laborers, especially those involved in state construction projects. Bread rations. Beer rations. Vegetables. Fish. These supplies kept entire building operations alive. Even the mighty pyramids depended not only on stone and labor, but on endless amounts of grain moving through bakeries, breweries, storage rooms, kitchens, and river transport boats. Behind every monument stood thousands of ordinary meals. Hori leaned back against the shaded wall and closed his eyes briefly. For a moment, he listened only to the river. The Nile moved slowly nearby, reflecting sunlight like liquid gold. Reeds swayed gently along the shore while fishing boats drifted through the distance. The river never truly rested. Even now, fishermen continued working beneath the afternoon sky. Some cast nets from small wooden boats. Others stood in shallow water holding spears patiently beside clusters of reeds. Fish were plentiful during many seasons, though catching enough still required skill and patience. Workers valued fish greatly because meat from cattle remained expensive for ordinary families. Wealthier Egyptians could afford beef, goose, duck, or lamb more often. But poor laborers relied mainly on grains, vegetables, and whatever fish the Nile provided. Sometimes fish were cooked fresh beside small fires. Other times they were salted and dried beneath the sun for storage. The smell of drying fish often drifted through villages near the riverbanks, mixing with smoke, mud, and baking bread. For children growing up beside the Nile, these smells became part of daily life from the very beginning. As the break ended, workers slowly returned to their tasks. Nobody hurried. There were still many hours before sunset. The afternoon passed heavily. The sun moved slowly westward while shadows stretched longer across the ground. Clay dried quickly in the heat. Dust clung to skin and clothing. Hori continued carrying baskets from the riverbank toward damaged walls where fresh mud bricks were being stacked carefully into place. The labor repeated endlessly. Lift. Walk. Lower. Return. Again and again beneath the burning sky. Sometimes workers sang softly together while working, especially during difficult labor. The songs were slow and repetitive, helping groups move in rhythm. But today, most remained quiet. The heat had taken too much energy for singing. Farther down the riverbank, another group of laborers unloaded sacks of grain from transport boats arriving from farming villages farther south. The grain would eventually become bread and beer for workers, officials, temple households, and city markets. Every grain shipment mattered. Egypt depended on successful harvests more than almost anything else. A poor flood season could bring hunger across entire regions. The Nile flood was both ordinary and sacred to ancient bones across the landscape. Palm trees cast longer shadows over the riverbank while birds circled lower above the water. Workers began slowing their pace. The end of the labor day was near. Bodies felt exhausted now. Shoulders burned. Hands hurt. Feet ached from hours standing on hard ground. Hori lowered his final basket and stretched carefully. The air still felt warm, but the worst heat had finally passed. One by one, laborers gathered tools and prepared for the walk back toward their villages. Some men washed their faces and arms beside the Nile before leaving. Cool water touched tired skin. The relief felt almost peaceful. Hori knelt beside the river and splashed water gently across his neck. Nearby, reeds rustled softly in the evening breeze. The sky above Egypt was beginning to change colors now. Pale gold slowly mixed with deeper orange near the horizon. This was often the most beautiful hour of the day. Not the burning noon. Not the darkness before sunrise. But the quiet time between labor and night. As workers began the journey home, the smells of evening cooking fires already drifted across the village paths ahead. Bread baking again. Lentils boiling slowly. Fish roasting above open flames. Garlic crushed beside clay bowls. After long hours of labor, these smells carried comfort stronger than almost anything else. The village itself looked calmer in evening light. Children played near doorways while women prepared meals beside outdoor ovens. Donkeys rested in shaded corners. Older villagers sat quietly outside their homes speaking softly together while the heat slowly faded from the earth. Tia was already preparing the evening meal when Hori returned home. Their daughter sat nearby sorting dates into small baskets while their son carried water from a nearby jar. Inside the house, the air smelled warm and familiar. Smoke. bread, grain, dust, palm fiber mats. The simple smells of ordinary Egyptian life. Tonight's meal would not be large. A pot of lentils simmered slowly near the fire while fresh bread cooled beside the oven. There was also dried fish left from the previous day and a handful of onions resting near the wall. Simple food again. But after a long workday, it would be enough. Hori sat quietly near the doorway while evening shadows spread slowly across the village outside. The hardest part of the day had passed. Soon darkness would return to the Nile. Stars would appear above the silent desert. Cooking fires would fade one by one across the worker homes. And tomorrow morning, before sunrise, the same rhythm would begin once again with bread, beer, grain, and the slow steady labor that carried ancient Egypt forward through the centuries. Night settled slowly across the Nile Valley. The heat of the day still lingered in the mud walls and dusty ground, but little by little the air became softer. Above the village, the sky darkened into deep shades of blue while the first stars quietly appeared over the desert horizon. Cooking fires glowed outside small homes like tiny orange lights scattered beside the river. The workers had returned. After long hours beneath the sun, the evening always felt different from the rest of the day. Movements became slower. Voices became quieter. Even the animals resting near the home seemed calmer beneath the cooling sky. Inside Hori's house, the evening meal was nearly ready. The lentils had softened in the clay pot after hours near the fire. Tia stirred them carefully with a wooden spoon while steam rose gently into the room. Beside the hearth sat warm bread wrapped in cloth to keep it soft. Their daughter peeled onions slowly while their son watched the fire closely, adding small pieces of dried reed whenever the flames weakened. The room smelled rich and earthy. Lentils, smoke, warm grain, garlic, clay warmed by fire. For ordinary Egyptian families, meals often carried these same familiar smells every evening. Nothing changed very quickly in village life. The same foods returned day after day, season after season, generation after generation. And strangely, there was comfort inside that repetition. After difficult labor, workers did not dream of endless variety. They dreamed of enough food, enough grain, enough beer, enough peace at the end of the day to rest tired bodies before sunrise returned once more. Hori leaned against the wall quietly while rubbing his sore hands. His palms felt rough from carrying wet clay baskets all afternoon. Dust still covered parts of his arms despite washing beside the Nile before returning home. Years of labor slowly changed the body. Shoulders widened from lifting. Hands hardened from tools and rope. Feet thickened from walking dirt paths and hot ground. Many Egyptian workers grew old before their time. The labor was constant. The heat relentless. Yet life continued steadily beside the river because it had to. Fields needed planting. Canals needed clearing. Buildings needed repair. Grain needed grinding. And always, families needed food waiting at the end of the day. Tia finally carried the evening meal toward the center of the room. There were no fancy tables covered in shining dishes like those inside wealthy Egyptian homes. Ordinary workers usually ate sitting close together on mats or low stools beside the floor. The meal itself was simple. Bread, lentils, onions, a small portion of dried fish, beer poured carefully into clay cups. Still, the children smiled softly when the food arrived. Hunger made even simple meals feel valuable. Hori tore a piece of bread and dipped it into the lentils. The stew was thick and warm. Lentils were important in ancient Egypt because they provided nourishment without costing as much as meat. Poor families depended on beans, lentils, and vegetables regularly. Sometimes meals also included chickpeas or broad beans cooked slowly over fire. These foods filled the stomach after long labor days and could be prepared in large pots for entire families. Outside, more voices drifted through the village now. Neighbors spoke quietly near doorways. Children laughed softly while chasing one another beneath the darkening sky. Somewhere nearby, music floated faintly through the warm evening air. A simple flute. Slow and gentle. The Nile villages were never completely silent. Even at night, life moved softly around the riverbanks. After eating for a while, Hori reached toward the dried fish. The fish had been salted heavily for preservation. Its smell remained strong, though the family was used to it. Fish mattered deeply in Egypt because the Nile provided it so reliably. For poor laborers especially, fish often became the closest thing to regular meat in their diets. Some families caught their own fish using nets or woven traps placed near reeds along the riverbanks. Others bought dried fish from village markets where fishermen sold their daily catches. Markets themselves were busy places filled with smells, dust, voices, and movement. Workers visiting village markets might see baskets of onions stacked beside garlic bundles. Dates rested in woven trays while grain sellers measured barley carefully into sacks. There were vegetables too. Lettuce, leeks, cucumbers, beans, and sometimes fruits brought from orchards near wealthier lands. But ordinary workers purchased carefully. Most families could not afford waste. Every loaf of bread represented labor. Every jar of beer required grain. Every onion mattered during difficult seasons. As the family ate, the fire crackled softly beside them. The light flickered across the mud walls while shadows moved gently through the room. Outside, the stars had become brighter now above the Nile. Ancient Egyptians looked often toward the night sky. Without modern lights, the stars appeared endless across the darkness. Constellations stretched clearly above the desert while the river reflected tiny points of silver light. For workers lying outside after long days of labor, the night sky could feel enormous and peaceful at the same time. Hori's son slowly began to fall asleep beside the wall before finishing his bread. Tia smiled softly and brushed crumbs from the child's linen clothing. Children in worker families often helped with tasks from an early age. Girls learned grinding, cooking, carrying water, and preparing food. Boys helped in fields, workshops, fishing boats, or construction sites as they grew older. Life beside the Nile required many hands. Even simple meals demanded hours of labor before they reached the table. Grain had to be planted. Floods had to arrive correctly. Harvests had to succeed. Seeds needed grinding. Dough required baking. Beer needed brewing. Behind every evening meal stood an entire chain of work stretching across the seasons. And much of that work belonged to women. Women spent enormous amounts of time preparing food in ancient Egypt. Grinding grain alone could consume hours every single day. Archaeologists studying ancient skeletons have found signs of physical stress in the knees, backs, and arms of women who performed this repetitive labor for years. The body remembered the work even after death. Tia finished her meal slowly and began cleaning the clay bowls using water from a nearby jar. Nothing was wasted unnecessarily. Water required carrying. Fuel required gathering. Food required labor. The family lived carefully because most worker households needed to. Outside, the village had grown quieter now. Many cooking fires were beginning to fade. Workers sat outside their homes enjoying the cooler night air before sleep. Some repaired tools beneath starlight. Others mended baskets or sandals. A few simply rested in silence after the long day. Hori stepped outside and sat near the doorway. The ground still held warmth from the sun, but the breeze from the Nile felt pleasant now against his tired skin. In the distance, he could hear frogs near the water and the faint movement of reeds swaying softly in the dark. The river never seemed completely asleep. Somewhere far away, boats still moved slowly through the night carrying grain, stone, or supplies between villages and cities. Egypt depended on movement along the Nile. The river connected workers, farmers, markets, temples, and royal cities together like a long living road flowing through the land. Hori looked upward toward the stars. Tomorrow would likely be the same as today. More labor. More heat. More bread and beer. More aching muscles beside the riverbank. Yet there was something steady about this rhythm. The repetition itself became part of life. Seasons changed slowly. Floodwaters returned. Children grew older. Workers aged beneath the sun. And through all of it, meals continued appearing quietly at the beginning and end of each day. Bread beside the fire. Beer inside clay jars. Fish from the Nile. Onions carried to work sites. Lentils simmering slowly beneath evening shadows. Simple foods carried ancient Egypt upon their shoulders just as surely as the workers themselves carried stone, mud, wood, and grain across the land beside the endless river. The canal stretched across the farmland like a narrow ribbon of dark water and wet earth. When Hori and the other workers finally arrived, the morning sun had already begun warming the fields around them. Thin mist still floated low above parts of the water, but it was disappearing quickly beneath the growing light. The canal needed clearing before the next irrigation cycle. Mud from the recent flood season had settled heavily along the bottom. Reeds and broken branches blocked parts of the water flow. If the canal remained clogged, nearby fields would dry too quickly beneath the Egyptian heat. And dry fields meant weak harvests. So the workers stepped into the mud without complaint. Their feet sank immediately into the cool wet earth. Some men used wooden shovels. Others filled baskets with thick mud and carried them toward the banks. A few cut away reeds using simple knives while insects moved constantly through the tall grass nearby. The work was slow and repetitive. But many Egyptian jobs were like this. Long hours. Simple movements. Endless repetition. The body learned the rhythm eventually. Lift. Carry. Return. Again and again beneath the sun. Hori bent down and pushed his hands into the wet mud at the canal edge. The earth felt cool compared to the warming air above him. For a moment, he appreciated the feeling. By midday, the entire canal would become hot beneath the blazing sun. The mud itself would begin warming against bare legs while sweat covered every worker from head to foot. So the coolness of morning mattered. Nearby, birds searched through shallow water for insects and tiny fish. Frogs disappeared into reeds whenever workers stepped too close. The Nile Valley was full of life when viewed quietly enough. Not only people, but birds, fish, cattle, insects, palm trees moving gently in the breeze. Everything depended upon the river. The workers continued steadily through the morning while the sunlight slowly brightened across the land. Some men spoke softly while working. Others remained silent. Conversations usually stayed simple. Talk about flood levels. About grain prices in nearby markets. About sick children. About damaged roofs needing repair before the next season. Ordinary life filled their thoughts far more than politics or royal ceremonies. Kings existed far away. But food, weather, labor, and family lived directly beside them every day. After several hours, the first break finally arrived. The workers climbed from the canal slowly, their legs coated with dark mud. Most gathered beneath a shaded structure made from wooden poles and woven reeds. The shade was thin, but it helped. Hori sat carefully beside another laborer named Painasi, an older man with rough hands and deep lines across his face from decades beneath the Egyptian sun. Painasi opened a small cloth bundle. Inside rested coarse bread, garlic, and dried fish. The smell of garlic filled the warm air immediately. Hori smiled softly. Nearly every worker carried similar meals. Simple food survived well during long labor days. Bread stayed filling. Onions and garlic traveled easily. Dried fish lasted for days without spoiling. The workers ate slowly while resting tired muscles. Nearby stood large jars of beer covered with damp cloth to keep them cooler beneath the heat. One by one, laborers dipped cups into the cloudy drink. The beer tasted thick and sour. Yet after hours of muddy labor, it felt refreshing. Egyptian workers depended heavily upon beer not only because of thirst, but because it provided nutrition. Some historians believe laborers consumed large amounts every day simply to maintain enough energy for physical work. Beer was not treated as luxury. It was part of survival. Even children drank weaker forms regularly inside many households. Painasi tore a piece of bread and stared quietly toward the fields beyond the canal. Green crops moved gently beneath the wind while farmers guided oxen through darker soil farther away. "It looks like a good season," he said softly. Hori nodded. Good harvests brought relief to everyone. When crops grew tall and healthy, workers worried less about shortages. Grain stores remained fuller. Bread became easier to afford. But bad seasons carried fear. Older workers still remembered years when floodwaters behaved poorly and grain became scarce across some villages. Hunger moved quietly through Egypt during those times. Not always dramatic starvation. Sometimes simply less food. Smaller bread portions. Weaker beer. Empty storage jars appearing too early before the next harvest. Ordinary workers noticed these things immediately because food shaped every hour of life. The break ended slowly. The men stood again and returned to the canal beneath the strengthening sun. By midday, the heat had become intense. The sky above Egypt looked pale and almost white with brightness. Air shimmered above the fields while insects buzzed lazily through the heavy warmth. Sweat rolled constantly down Hori's back as he lifted another basket of mud from the canal floor. The labor became harder now. Arms tired faster. Breathing felt heavier. Even simple movements demanded effort. But the work continued because irrigation mattered too much to stop. Ancient Egypt survived through careful control of water. Canals carried Nile water into fields far from the riverbanks. Workers maintained these systems generation after generation, digging, repairing, clearing, and rebuilding constantly. Without irrigation, much of the land would return quickly to dry desert. And desert could not feed villages. Hori paused briefly and looked toward the horizon. Beyond the green farmland, sandy hills stretched outward beneath the burning sky. The contrast always felt striking. Life beside the river. Silence beyond it. Egypt existed between those two worlds. The fertile Nile Valley and the endless desert. As the afternoon passed, some workers began singing softly to maintain rhythm while carrying mud baskets. The song moved slowly. Low voices rising and falling together beneath the heat. The words were simple. Old. Repeated many times through the years. Songs like these helped laborers continue when exhaustion settled heavily into the body. Even the rhythm of work itself sometimes felt musical. Footsteps through mud. Baskets lowering onto earth. Water splashing quietly beside reeds. Ancient Egypt was full of these small repeating sounds. Late in the afternoon, the workers finally received another meal break. This time, Hori shared dates he had carried from home. The sweetness felt pleasant after hours of salty sweat and muddy labor. Dates remained one of the most loved foods in Egypt. Palm trees lined parts of the Nile Valley, their branches swaying above villages and fields. Families collected the fruit carefully during harvest seasons and dried many of them for storage. Some workers also made date cakes or mixed dates into simple meals for extra sweetness and energy. Even a few dates could brighten a difficult day. Painasi chewed slowly while watching birds circle above the canal water. Then he laughed quietly. Not loudly. Just enough to break the heavy silence. He pointed toward a younger worker who had slipped knee-deep into thick mud moments earlier while carrying a basket. The young man climbed out slowly, completely covered in dark wet earth while the others smiled tiredly around him. Small moments like this mattered. Workers found brief humor where they could. Life was difficult enough already. As the sun finally began lowering westward, the worst heat slowly faded. Long shadows stretched across the canal banks while the fields turned softer shades of gold and green beneath the evening light. The workers finished their final tasks carefully. Tomorrow, more labor would continue here. More mud. More baskets. More aching muscles beneath the sun. The work of Egypt never truly ended. Hori washed his arms beside the canal before beginning the journey home. Cool water removed layers of mud from his skin while reeds rustled gently nearby. The evening breeze had returned now. Soft. Pleasant. Almost calming after the brutal heat of afternoon. The workers walked back toward the village together beneath the golden sky. Ahead of them, faint cooking smoke already rose above the mud brick homes beside the Nile. And with that smoke came familiar evening smells once more. Bread baking. Fish roasting. Garlic crushed beneath stone. Lentils simmering slowly beside small fires. The smells drifted across the land like quiet promises waiting at the end of another long day beside the endless river. The village looked peaceful in the evening light. As Hori and the other workers returned from the canals, the sky above the Nile glowed with soft shades of orange and pale red. Long shadows stretched across the dirt paths between the mud brick homes, and the heat that had ruled the afternoon slowly loosened its grip upon the land. Children played near the wells while older villagers sat quietly outside their homes enjoying the cooler air. From almost every house came the smell of cooking. Warm bread. Boiling beans. Smoke rising from clay ovens. Fish roasting above small fires beside the doorways. The smells drifted together through the village and settled gently into the evening air. For workers returning from long labor beneath the sun, these smells carried deep comfort. Hori walked slowly now. His legs still ached from standing in the canal mud all day, and dried patches of earth clung stubbornly to his sandals. But the hardest hours were behind him. Night was coming. And night meant rest. Near the center of the village, several women were still grinding grain beside their homes. Even sunset approached, the work continued. The grinding stones moved back and forth with slow steady rhythm. Scrape. Push. Scrape. Push. The sound blended softly with evening voices and the distant movement of the Nile. Women in ancient Egypt spent enormous parts of their lives preparing food. Grain grinding alone consumed hours every day, especially in larger households. Some families worked together during these tasks. Mothers beside daughters. Sisters beside sisters. Neighbors helping one another during busy seasons. The labor became part of daily life from childhood onward. Hori paused briefly near one house where an older woman shaped dough carefully with flour-covered hands. Beside her, fresh loaves rested on cloth waiting for the oven. The smell reminded him of his own mother many years earlier. He remembered waking before sunrise as a child while she prepared bread in almost the same way. The sounds, smells, and routines of food rarely changed across generations. Children grew up watching these same movements every day. The kneading of dough. The pouring of beer. The slicing of onions. The carrying of water jars from the river. Ancient Egyptian life often moved slowly enough that entire generations lived nearly identical daily routines. At home, Tia had already prepared part of the evening meal. A clay pot simmered gently near the fire while smoke drifted upward through a roof opening. Their daughter sat nearby removing date pits carefully into a small basket. The room glowed softly from firelight. Hori stepped inside and immediately felt the warmth of home around him. Simple walls. Woven mats. Clay jars lined beside the corners. The smell of grain and smoke lingering in the air. Nothing luxurious. Yet after exhausting labor, even a modest home could feel comforting. Tia looked up and smiled faintly as Hori entered. "You are late," she said softly. "The canal work took longer today." Hori sat carefully beside the wall and stretched his sore legs. Outside, darkness was spreading slowly across the Nile Valley now. The final light of sunset faded behind distant desert hills while stars began appearing overhead one by one. The children helped prepare the meal. Their son carried small cups for beer while their daughter arranged bread near the center of the room. The family moved naturally through these routines without needing many words. They had repeated them too many times already. Tonight's meal included broad beans cooked slowly with garlic and herbs. There was bread again, of course, and small portions of salted fish. The fish smelled strong. But strong smells were common in Egyptian cooking. Garlic, onions, fish, fermented beer, smoke from cooking fires. These scents filled villages beside the Nile every evening. Hori tore a piece of bread and dipped it into the beans. The meal was plain, but filling. Most worker families valued fullness more than variety. Food needed to satisfy hunger after long labor days, not impress guests with expensive ingredients. The wealthy ate differently. Inside noble homes or temple kitchens, cooks prepared roasted meats, fine cakes sweetened with honey, fruits served on decorated trays, and wine stored in elegant jars. But those meals belonged to another world. Workers lived closer to necessity. And necessity often tasted like grain. As the family ate, sounds from the village drifted softly through the doorway. Someone nearby played a flute again. A baby cried briefly before quieting. Men spoke together beside a distant fire. The Nile itself moved silently beyond the darkness. Tia handed Hori a small onion. He smiled softly. Onions were among the most common foods in ancient Egypt. Cheap, strong, and easy to grow, they appeared in worker meals constantly. Many laborers believed onions helped maintain strength during difficult physical work. Garlic carried similar importance. Some workers even carried onions to work sites as carefully as others carried tools. Hori bit into the onion slowly. Its sharp taste mixed with the warm beans and rough bread. Simple flavors. Familiar flavors. The kind a person remembered for an entire lifetime. After eating, the children stepped outside briefly while the night air cooled the village. Above them, the stars looked endless. Without city lights, ancient Egyptian nights could feel incredibly clear and vast. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like pale dust scattered through darkness. Workers often spent evenings outside simply because the air felt better there after sunset. The mud brick homes trapped heat during the day, but outside, gentle breezes from the Nile moved through the villages pleasantly. Hori joined the children outside and sat near the doorway. Across the village, tiny fires still glowed while families finished meals or prepared food for tomorrow. Some women already soaked grain for the next morning's bread. Others stored leftover food carefully inside jars or baskets protected from insects and animals. Food storage required constant attention. Egyptian families worked hard to preserve supplies during good seasons because nobody could fully trust the future. A damaged harvest. A poor flood. A sickness within the household. Any problem could threaten survival. So even ordinary food carried importance beyond simple hunger. Grain meant safety. Beer meant strength. Stored dates meant security during difficult weeks. Hori's son leaned sleepily against his father's shoulder. The child smelled faintly of smoke and dust from playing outside. Far away across the Nile, a jackal cried once in the darkness. Then silence returned. The night deepened slowly. Some villagers were already asleep now after exhausting labor in fields or workshops. Others remained awake beside fading fires while talking quietly under the stars. Tomorrow, the routines would begin again before sunrise. The grinding stones. The ovens. The fields. The canals. The bread wrapped carefully for midday meals. Ancient Egypt moved forward through repetition. Not dramatic moments every day. Not grand celebrations every night. Mostly ordinary people repeating ordinary tasks beside the river. And yet those small daily routines built one of history's greatest civilizations. Not only kings. Not only monuments. But workers eating bread in dimly lit homes. Women grinding grain before dawn. Children carrying water jars beside dusty roads. Fishermen pulling nets through quiet morning water. Their lives moved slowly beside the Nile, carried gently forward by food, labor, sunlight, and the endless rhythm of the river itself. The night passed quietly over the Nile Valley. A cool breeze drifted through the village while the last cooking fires slowly faded into darkness. Above the mud brick homes, the stars remained bright and endless, hanging over Egypt with silent patience. Most workers slept deeply now. After days filled with heat and labor, the body accepted sleep quickly. Hori rested beside his family on woven mats spread across the floor. The room smelled faintly of ash, grain, and warm clay. Outside, reeds near the river whispered softly in the night wind. Somewhere in the darkness, fishermen were still awake. The Nile never fully slept. Even during the deepest hours of night, small boats sometimes moved slowly through the black water carrying grain, fish, or supplies between villages. Oars dipped gently into the river while lantern light flickered faintly against the current. For many Egyptian workers, life followed the rhythm of the Nile more closely than the rhythm of the sun. The river decided everything. Its floods shaped the fields. Its fish filled cooking pots. Its water fed the crops. Its transport connected towns and cities across Egypt. Without the Nile, the villages would disappear into silence and sand. Long before sunrise, Hori woke again. The village remained dark and still for a few moments. He could hear only the breathing of his family and the faint movement of wind outside the doorway. Then slowly, another day began. Tea arose quietly and rekindled the fire. A tiny glow spread through the room. Soon came the familiar sound of grinding stones once more. Back and forth. Steady and patient. The sound belonged to Egyptian mornings as surely as the river itself. Today would be different from the canal work of yesterday. Hori had agreed to help a fisherman named Mena along the Nile before returning later to labor near the storage houses. Extra fish meant extra food. And extra food always mattered. Tia prepared the morning meal carefully while darkness still rested outside. Bread again. Beer again. A few leftover beans from the night before. Simple meals repeated constantly across Egypt because grain remained the foundation of ordinary survival. The bread this morning felt slightly harder than yesterday's fresh loaves, but nobody complained. Workers rarely expected perfection from food. Only enough. Enough to begin the day. Enough to continue labor beneath the sun. Enough to keep children fed through another season. When dawn finally appeared, pale light spread slowly across the village. The Nile shimmered softly beneath the growing sky while birds gathered near the reeds searching for insects and fish along the water's edge. Hori stepped outside carrying a small basket and walked toward the riverbank where Mena waited beside his boat. The fisherman was older than Hori. His skin had darkened deeply after decades beneath the sunlight reflected from the Nile. His hands looked rough from rope, nets, and wet wood. "Good morning," Mena said quietly. Hori nodded. The boat rocked gently beside the shore. It was small and simple, made from wood darkened by years of water and sun. Fishing nets rested in loose piles near the center while clay jars stood carefully secured near the sides. Together they pushed the boat into the river. Cool water touched Hori's ankles for a moment before he climbed aboard. The Nile felt peaceful during early morning hours. Mist drifted low above the surface while distant palm trees reflected softly in the still water. The world seemed quieter here away from the village paths and work sites. Mena rowed slowly. The only sounds came from the oars dipping into the river and birds calling overhead. Fishing required patience. Workers who spent their lives beside the Nile understood how to wait quietly. Rushing rarely helped. Mena guided the boat toward a patch of reeds where fish often gathered in deeper water. Then carefully, he lifted one of the nets. The rope felt damp and rough against Hori's hands. Together they cast the net outward. It spread briefly through the air before sinking beneath the water with barely a sound. Then came more waiting. The sun slowly rose higher above the Nile Valley, painting the river with pale gold light. Nearby, other fishermen drifted quietly through the morning water in similar boats. Some used nets. Others held spears. A few checked woven traps placed among the reeds during the night. Fish were one of Egypt's most important food sources. For ordinary workers especially, the Nile provided protein that wealthier meats often could not. Dried or salted fish appeared in countless meals across villages beside the river. The smell of fish became part of life itself. Fish drying in sunlight. Fish cooking above fires. Fish carried through markets in woven baskets. Mena finally began pulling the net slowly back toward the boat. Water dripped from the ropes. Then silver movement flashed beneath the surface. Several fish twisted inside the net while sunlight reflected brightly from their scales. Not a huge catch, but enough. Mena smiled softly. "A good morning," he said. Hori helped place the fish carefully into baskets at the bottom of the boat. The smell of river water mixed with the sharp scent of fresh fish. As the morning continued, they repeated the process again and again. Cast the net. Wait quietly. Pull slowly. The work felt calmer than canal labor or hauling clay baskets beneath the heat. But fishing still demanded strength and endurance. Hours passed steadily beneath the rising sun. By late morning, the air had already become warmer. Mena opened a cloth bundle and shared the midday meal with Hori. Bread. onions, a few dried dates. The food tasted especially good beside the water. Workers often appreciated simple meals more deeply after hours of physical labor. Hunger sharpened every flavor. Hori looked toward the riverbank while eating. Women carrying water jars moved along dusty paths. Farmers worked in distant fields. Palm trees swayed slowly beneath the brightening sky. Everywhere beside the Nile, people were working. Grinding. Fishing. Harvesting. Building. Cooking. Ancient Egypt survived because millions of ordinary tasks continued every single day without stopping. Mena drank from a clay cup filled with beer and wiped his mouth slowly. When I was young, he said quietly, the river felt larger. Hori smiled faintly. Older workers often spoke this way. Perhaps the Nile truly changed over time. Or perhaps memory itself softened the past into something calmer and wider. The fisherman stared toward the water for a long moment. My father taught me these nets, he continued softly. And his father taught him. The words drifted quietly across the river. Many Egyptian skills passed from generation to generation like this. Baking. Fishing. Stonework. Farming. Children learned by watching adults repeat the same tasks again and again. Knowledge moved through daily life more than written lessons. The sun climbed higher. Soon the pleasant coolness of morning disappeared completely. Heat spread across the riverbanks while insects buzzed above the reeds. The fishermen finished gathering their catch and began rowing slowly back toward the village. The baskets smelled strongly now from fresh fish warming beneath the sunlight. As the boat approached shore, village sounds grew louder again. Voices. Animals. Children running through narrow paths. The distant scraping of grinding stones. Life beside the Nile continued endlessly. Hori stepped from the boat carrying part of the catch. Tonight, his family would eat better than usual. Fresh fish instead of dried. A small difference perhaps. But for ordinary workers, small differences mattered. A little more food. A little more rest. A cooler evening breeze after a difficult day. These things brought quiet happiness into lives built mostly from labor and repetition. The sun stood high above Egypt now. And another long afternoon waited ahead beside the endless river. The afternoon sun returned with its familiar weight. It did not arrive quickly or suddenly, but slowly, like it always did over the Nile Valley. The light grew stronger, the air grew stiller, and the world began to feel heavier as the day moved forward. Hori walked back through the village carrying the fish carefully wrapped in cloth. The smell followed him. Fresh river fish had a sharp, clean scent that mixed with the dust of the road and the warmth of the rising heat. Birds moved low over the fields while distant workers continued their tasks beneath the sun. Today's catch meant something simple but important. A better meal tonight. As he passed through the narrow paths between mud brick homes, Hori noticed how every household was already preparing for the same rhythm again. Cooking fires were being rebuilt. Water jars were being refilled from the river. Grain was being measured out for grinding. Bread dough was already forming in a few homes where women worked early without pause. Food preparation in ancient Egypt was never truly finished. It was always beginning again. Inside his home, Tia smiled faintly when she saw the fish. For a moment, the tiredness of routine seemed to soften slightly in her expression. Fresh from the river, she asked. Hori nodded. The children gathered around immediately, looking at the wrapped fish with quiet excitement. Fresh fish was not an everyday event. It depended on luck, timing, and the river itself. Tia began preparing the afternoon meal slowly. The fish would be cleaned, salted lightly, and cooked over the small fire with onions and garlic. Bread would be baked again later in the evening as well. Even on ordinary days, food preparation never stopped in Egyptian households. The fire in the hearth was like a constant heartbeat inside the home. It rose in the morning. It stayed through midday. It faded slowly at night. Then returned again before dawn. Outside, the heat grew stronger. Hori rested briefly near the doorway while watching the village continue its slow movement through the afternoon. This was the hardest part of the day for many workers. Not because of action, but because of stillness. Between morning labor and evening relief, the afternoon often felt long and heavy. Some workers used this time to repair tools. Others slept briefly in shaded corners. Some simply sat quietly conserving energy for the next day. Hori cleaned his fishing tools slowly beside the wall. The rope still felt damp from the river. The net carried the faint smell of water and fish scales. Nearby, a group of children passed through the path carrying small bundles of grain toward a grinding area. Even children participated in daily life early in Egypt. They learned responsibilities gradually. Fetching water. Helping prepare bread. Watching younger siblings. Assisting with small farming or household tasks. Life beside the Nile did not allow long separation between childhood and labor. Time moved differently here. Not rushed, but steady. Unbroken. By mid-afternoon, the smell of cooking fish began to drift from Hori's home into the village air. Garlic sizzling in clay pots. Onions softening in heat. Fish roasting slowly over fire. The aroma was strong and familiar. Neighbors often recognized what was being cooked simply by smell. In a nearby home, someone was baking bread again. In another, lentils simmered with herbs. Each household created its own small version of the same basic diet that sustained Egyptian workers across the land. Bread. Grain. Beans. Fish. Onions. Garlic. Beer. The same foundation repeated everywhere, adjusted slightly depending on access, season, and wealth. Even temples followed similar patterns, though with greater abundance and ritual preparation. Food was not only survival. It was also structure. It organized the day. It organized labor. It organized family life. It even organized time itself. Morning meals marked the beginning of work. Midday meals marked rest. Evening meals marked return and recovery. Hori stepped outside again as the sun began to lower slightly. The canal workers from earlier days were returning along the distant paths, their bodies tired but steady. Dust covered their clothing again, and their movements were slower than in the morning. Another group of farmers passed nearby carrying bundles of harvested reeds. The village always seemed to be in motion. Even when resting, something was happening. The Nile ensured that. At the center of the village, a small storage building stood where grain collected from taxes and harvest contributions was kept. Hori paused briefly as he walked past it. Large clay jars were stacked carefully inside. These jars represented security for the entire community. Grain inside them could be measured and distributed during difficult seasons. It could be turned into bread for workers or beer for labor crews. Without these stores, survival would become uncertain very quickly. Ancient Egypt functioned through careful balance. The river provided abundance. But people had to store and manage it wisely. As evening approached once more, the village began to shift again. Cooking fires returned to life across homes. Children gathered near doorways. Workers cleaned dust from their hands and arms. Water was poured into cups and shared between family members. Hori returned inside as Tia finished cooking the fish. The meal tonight felt slightly richer than usual. Fresh fish. Soft bread. Onions cooked until sweet. Beer cooled in clay jars. The children sat closer than usual, eager for the food. Tia served everyone carefully. No rushing. No waste. No excess. Just enough for each person. Hori tasted the fish slowly. It was simple, but satisfying. The river had provided again. After eating, the family sat together quietly while night slowly approached outside. This moment always felt different from the rest of the day. The labor had ended. The heat had softened. The world outside became quieter. Only the sounds of village life remained. Soft conversation. Distant footsteps. The faint movement of water along the Nile shore. Hori leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes for a moment. His body ached less now that food had been eaten. Bread and fish did not erase fatigue, but they made it easier to carry. In ancient Egypt, food was not just pleasure. It was recovery. It restored strength after labor. It prepared the body for tomorrow's work. It connected each day to the next. As darkness slowly returned outside, the stars began appearing once more above the river. Another cycle was nearly complete. Another day of bread, labor, water, and rest was fading into night. And somewhere in the quiet rhythm of the Nile, life continued to move forward, slowly and endlessly, carried by ordinary meals and ordinary people living simple lives beside an ancient river that never stopped flowing. Night returned gently over the Nile Valley, the way it always did, without hurry and without sound. The last traces of orange light faded from the western sky, leaving behind a deep, calm blue that slowly darkened into black. Stars appeared one by one above the river, as if someone were quietly lighting small lamps across the heavens. In the village, fires grew smaller. Not because the people had stopped living, but because the day had simply reached its end. Inside Hori's home, the family settled into quiet rest after the evening meal. The taste of fish still lingered softly in memory, mixed with bread and onions and the faint warmth of beer. The body felt calmer now, no longer pushed by hunger or labor. This was the peaceful space between exhaustion and sleep. Hori sat near the doorway again, as he often did at night. The ground beneath him still held a little warmth from the day's sun. Above him, the night air felt cooler against his skin. From inside the house came the soft breathing of his children as they drifted toward sleep. Across the village, similar scenes unfolded everywhere. Families resting. Cooking fires fading. Quiet conversations ending slowly. Clay pots cooling beside hearths. The Nile flowed nearby, steady and endless in the darkness. It did not sleep. It did not stop. It simply continued, as it always had, carrying water through Egypt like a slow heartbeat beneath the night sky. Far down the river, fishermen were still moving quietly in small boats, their lanterns flickering faintly across the water's surface. The reflections trembled gently with every movement of the current. For some workers, the night was also a time of labor. But for most, it was rest. Sleep in ancient Egypt was not rushed or forced. It came naturally after long days filled with physical effort and simple food. The body understood the rhythm well. Work. Eat. Rest. Repeat. Tia cleaned the last of the cooking tools beside the hearth. Water was carefully poured into clay bowls. Leftover food was stored safely. Bread was wrapped to remain fresh for the next morning. Nothing was wasted. Every part of food had purpose. Even scraps were treated with care because grain, fish, and vegetables all represented hours of human labor somewhere along the Nile. Hori watched quietly as his family prepared for sleep. He thought, as many workers likely did, not in words but in sensations. The ache of his arms. The warmth of bread. The smell of river water. The sound of grinding stones from earlier in the day. The taste of onions still faintly sharp on his tongue. These small things formed the shape of his life. Not grand events. Not distant rulers. Not monuments rising far away in stone cities. But daily survival. Food was at the center of it all. Every sunrise began with bread and grain. Every afternoon depended on beer and simple meals. Every evening ended with whatever food the river and fields had provided. Without food, nothing else could continue. Not labor. Not families. Not villages. Not Egypt itself. Hori finally stood and stepped inside the home. The room was darker now, lit only by faint embers from the dying fire. His children slept close together, their small bodies rising and falling gently with each breath. Tia lay down quietly beside them. Soon, silence filled the room completely. Outside, the village had become still. Only the distant sound of the Nile remained, flowing slowly through the darkness like a constant presence that never left. Above it all, the stars stretched wide and endless. Ancient Egyptians often looked at the night sky with quiet attention. Not with urgency, but with calm awareness that the same sky had always been there, watching over the river, the fields, the villages, and the workers who lived beside them. Hori remained awake for a short time longer. Listening. The wind moved softly through palm leaves outside. A distant bird called once and then disappeared. Somewhere far away, water touched river banks with a slow rhythmic sound. Then even those sounds faded. Sleep finally came. Not sudden. Not dramatic. Just a slow drifting away from thought, from hunger, from labor, from the weight of the day. And in that quiet darkness, life in ancient Egypt continued its endless rhythm. Fields would be worked again tomorrow. Bread would be baked again before sunrise. Beer would be poured again into clay cups. Fish would be pulled from the Nile once more. Grain would be ground on stone. And workers would rise again beneath the same sky, beside the same river, carrying forward the same quiet routine that had shaped their lives for generations. The Nile kept flowing. And so did time. Slowly. Softly. Endlessly. Before the first light returned, the world felt still again. The Nile lay quiet beneath a sky so dark it almost looked endless, as if the river and the night were part of the same deep, silent fabric stretching across Egypt. Even the wind seemed to rest for a while, moving only gently through reeds along the river banks. Inside the village, sleep held everyone tightly. Workers who had carried stone, mud, grain, and nets through the previous day now rested without awareness of time. Their bodies recovered slowly in the cool darkness, preparing for another cycle that would arrive soon enough. Hori slept deeply. His breathing was steady, matched quietly by the breathing of his family around him. The smell of ash and grain still lingered faintly inside the home, a reminder of the evening meal that had ended only a few hours earlier. Outside, the river never stopped. It moved forward with patient certainty, as it always had, shaping the land, feeding the fields, and connecting distant villages through water instead of roads. In ancient Egypt, the Nile was more than geography. It was structure. It was memory. It was life repeating itself in slow motion across centuries. Far away from the village homes, In places where the river widened slightly and reeds grew thick along the banks, small animals moved quietly through the night. Fish swam near the surface in shifting patterns beneath the dark water. Birds slept with heads tucked under wings on branches above the current. Everything rested. But nothing truly stopped. Then, gradually, as always, the sky began to change. Not suddenly. Not with urgency. But with a soft thinning of darkness at the edge of the world. A faint gray line appeared above the eastern horizon. The beginning of another morning. In the village, the first signs of waking returned almost without sound. A door shifting open. A cooking fire stirred carefully. A jar of water lifted and placed down again. A footstep across packed earth. The rhythm of Egyptian life resumed gently, as if it had never fully paused. Inside Hori's home, Tia moved first again. She always woke early. Grain had to be prepared before anything else. Bread required time. Dough needed attention. Fire needed careful control. Without early preparation, the entire day would fall behind. She added small reeds to the hearth. A faint glow returned. The familiar warmth of morning fire slowly spread through the room. Outside, birds began calling again near the Nile. Soft at first. Then gradually louder as more joined in. The village responded. Workers rose from sleep. Children shifted beneath cloth coverings. Tools were gathered. Sandals were tightened. Water jars were checked. Another day was beginning exactly as the last had ended and exactly as countless days before it. Hori opened his eyes slowly. For a brief moment, he did not move. He simply listened. The sound of fire. The sound of wind. The sound of distant water. The sound of life returning to motion. His body felt heavy at first, as it always did before movement. But this heaviness was familiar. It belonged to every morning of his life. He sat up slowly. Tia handed him a small piece of bread left from the previous evening. It was slightly dry now, but still edible. He ate it without complaint. Food was never wasted in households like this. Every piece mattered. Even hardened bread could be softened with water or beer and still provide strength for the day ahead. Outside, the sky brightened further. Pale gold light began to spread across the Nile Valley. Villages once again filled with quiet motion. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Grinding stones returned to work. Farmers moved toward fields. Fishermen prepared nets beside the river. Workers gathered tools for canal labor and construction sites. And everywhere, food preparation began again. Because in ancient Egypt, no day truly began without it. Bread was shaped. Grain was measured. Beer was poured. Onions were peeled. Fish were cleaned. Lentils were boiled. The same cycle returned endlessly, forming the foundation of daily existence. Hori stepped outside once more into the cool morning air. The Nile shimmered softly in the early light. He could already see other workers gathering along the paths, walking toward their assigned tasks for the day. Some would go to fields. Some to canals. Some to construction sites. Some to fishing boats. All of them would carry food with them. Wrapped bread. Small jars of beer. Simple bundles of onions or dried fish. The village itself slowly transformed into movement. Not chaos. Not rush. But steady, familiar motion. The kind that had repeated for generations. Hori joined the flow of workers walking toward the riverbank. The sun rose higher behind them, warming the land again as it had done countless times before. And as the Nile continued flowing beside them, carrying life through Egypt's narrow green valley, the quiet story of ordinary meals, ordinary labor, and ordinary survival continued forward one day at a time, without end, without pause, and without ever needing to be anything more than what it was. The morning light grew stronger across the Nile Valley. What had begun as a pale glow in the distance now spread fully over the land, touching the tops of palm trees, warming the surface of the river, and slowly revealing every path, field, and village home in soft gold. Hori walked with the other workers along the familiar road beside the water. Their footsteps were steady, unhurried. The day's labor had not yet begun, but everyone already carried the awareness of it in their bodies. The memory of yesterday's heat still lingered, and the knowledge of today's work waited quietly ahead. Some workers spoke softly while walking. Others remained silent. Conversation was never forced in these moments. The morning belonged more to thought than to speech. Ahead, the fields opened wide. Green stretches of crops sway gently in the morning breeze, still fresh from the Nile's blessing. Narrow irrigation channels cut through the land like veins, carrying water into every section of soil. This landscape was not natural in the way distant deserts were. It was shaped, maintained, protected. Every season, workers returned to it to repair what time and water had changed. Hori paused briefly at the edge of a field where farmers were already working. Oxen moved slowly forward, pulling wooden plows through damp earth. Behind them, men followed carefully, guiding seeds into the soil with practiced motions. The rhythm of farming was ancient. Plow, plant, water, wait, harvest, repeat. It had been this way for as long as memory could reach. And it depended entirely on food already existing in storage from previous harvests. Nothing in Egypt began from nothing. Everything depended on what had already been grown, gathered, and preserved. Hori continued walking until he reached the canal work site again, where a new section required clearing after overnight sediment had shifted with the water. The work looked similar to the previous day. And in many ways, it was. The same mud. The same baskets. The same water. The same heat waiting to arrive. Workers gathered without ceremony. Tools were picked up. Positions were taken. And the canal work began again. But before the sun reached its full strength, there was always a small moment of preparation. Food. A worker's day in ancient Egypt could not begin properly without it. Near the edge of the work site, several families had already arranged simple bundles of morning meals. Bread wrapped in cloth. Small jars of beer. Onions tied together. Occasionally dried fish or leftover beans from the previous evening. Hori sat briefly with Painasi and others as they ate before labor resumed. The bread was dense in his hands. Its texture rough from stone grinding, its flavor earthy and familiar. He chewed slowly, letting the food settle into his body. Beer followed soon after, thick and slightly sour, but cooling against the morning air. This was not indulgence. It was preparation. Energy stored for the long hours ahead. Around them, the canal shimmered under the strengthening sunlight. Water moved gently through partially cleared sections while reeds bent along the edges of the banks. Workers would spend the next hours restoring flow, ensuring that irrigation continued smoothly into surrounding fields. Without this system, the entire agricultural cycle would weaken. And without agriculture, food would disappear. Everything returned again to the same truth. Food was the center of existence. As work resumed, the rhythm returned quickly. Mud lifted. Baskets carried. Water splashed. Reeds cut and pulled aside. Earth reshaped. The sounds blended together into a steady background of labor. By midday, heat had once again fully arrived. The sun stood high and heavy above Egypt, turning the air still and bright. Sweat-covered skin. Shadows shrank beneath feet. Movement became slower and more deliberate. But work did not stop. Instead, it paused briefly again for food. Another break. Another small return to the same daily comfort. Hori opened his bundle. Bread again. Onions again. A few remaining dates saved from earlier. He ate slowly beneath a thin shade structure while others around him did the same. No one spoke loudly. Energy was conserved even in rest. Painasi leaned back against a wooden post and closed his eyes for a moment. Always the same, he said quietly. Hori looked toward him. The older worker opened his eyes again, gazing toward the canal. Bread in the morning, he continued. Bread at midday. Bread at night. There was no complaint in his voice. Only recognition. This repetition was not unusual. It was life itself. And strangely, it held a kind of stability within it. Because as long as food remained consistent, everything else could continue. Work. Family. Fields. Villages. Even the great cities along the Nile. All of it depended on these simple cycles. As the break ended, workers returned once more to the canal. The afternoon passed slowly. Heat. Labor. Water. Earth. Then, gradually, the sun began its descent again. Light softened. Shadows stretched. The harsh brightness of midday gave way to warmer tones, as if the entire landscape was exhaling after holding its breath for hours. Work continued until the final tasks were completed. When the canal flow was finally restored, a quiet sense of completion moved through the group. Not celebration. Not excitement. Just relief. Another section of Egypt had been maintained for another season. The workers gathered their tools and began walking back toward the village once more. The river accompanied them on their return. Calm. Steady. Unchanging. As they walked, Hori thought briefly about the meal waiting at home. Whatever it would be tonight, it would be familiar. Bread. Something from the fields or river. Perhaps beans. Perhaps fish again if the day had been fortunate. Nothing elaborate. But enough. And in the world of Egyptian workers, that was what mattered most. Enough food to end the day. Enough strength to begin the next. Behind them, the fields continued their slow existence beneath the evening sky. Ahead of them, the village fires were already beginning to glow again. And somewhere in between those 2 points, between labor and rest, between hunger and fullness, between one sunrise and the next, the life of ancient Egyptian workers continued its quiet, steady rhythm beside the endless Nile. Evening returned to the Nile Valley with a softness that always felt almost unreal after the harshness of the day. The light changed slowly, as if the world itself was becoming gentler. The sun lowered behind the desert hills, turning the sky into layers of gold, then orange, then deep fading red. Shadows stretched long across the fields and paths until everything seemed to rest inside them. Hori and the other workers walked back toward the village in tired silence. Their bodies carried the memory of the day's labor. Mud still clung to their sandals. Dust coated their skin. Muscles ached from repetition and heat. But there was a kind of relief in the walk home. Work had ended. Food and rest were near again. As they approached the village, the familiar sights of evening returned. Cooking fires glowing outside homes. Smoke rising slowly into the cooling air. Women stirring pots beside clay ovens. Children sitting near doorways waiting for meals. The sound of grinding stones continuing in some households where food for tomorrow was already being prepared. The village was never truly still. Even in rest, it moved gently. Hori entered his home just as Tia placed a fresh pot near the fire. The smell inside was warm and familiar. Bread baking again. Lentils simmering again. Garlic and onions softening in heat. A faint trace of yesterday's smoke still lingering in the corners of the room. Everything repeated. But repetition was not empty here. It was survival made visible. Tia handed him a small cup of beer while the children sat nearby watching the fire. The drink was thick and slightly warm, but it helped wash away the dryness of the day. Hori sat slowly, letting his body settle. Outside, night was approaching again. The river reflected the darkening sky while the first stars returned above the horizon. In many ways, evenings were the most peaceful part of life for Egyptian workers. Not because life was easy, but because for a few hours, labor no longer demanded their bodies. The world paused just enough to allow breathing. Tia began serving the evening meal. Bread once more. Lentils cooked slowly through the afternoon. A small portion of fish preserved from earlier days. Onions added for flavor. Beer shared between family members. Simple food. Always simple. But carefully prepared. Hori ate slowly. After long days of labor, even basic meals felt complete. Bread soaked in lentils softened quickly in his mouth. The taste was earthy and warm. The onions added sharpness. The fish carried a faint saltiness from the river. Nothing about it was extravagant. But it was enough to end hunger. And in this world, that mattered more than anything else. The children ate beside him quietly. Their movements slower now, their energy fading into evening calm. Outside, village life continued in soft patterns. Neighbors spoke gently near doorways. A flute sounded briefly from somewhere farther down the path. Dogs moved between houses searching for scraps of food. The river flowed steadily beside everything, unchanged and patient. Hori stepped outside after eating. The night air felt cool against his tired skin. Above him, the stars were clearer now, scattered across the sky like fine dust. Without artificial light, the night world of Egypt felt vast and deep. He sat on the ground near the doorway and listened. To the wind through palm leaves. To distant water along the Nile. To faint voices slowly fading into night. Food had ended the day again. It always did. Morning began with bread. Afternoon sustained with beer and simple meals. Evening closed with whatever the household could prepare. And in between those moments, life was built through labor. Fields were tended. Canals were cleared. Fish were caught. Stone was moved. Grain was ground. All of it returning eventually to the same center. Food. The most ordinary thing. And the most essential. As Hori sat quietly, he thought less in words and more in feeling. The weight of tired muscles. The comfort of a full stomach. The faint coolness of night air. The presence of his family inside the home. These were the things that shaped his world. Not grand events. Not distant rulers. Not monuments of stone rising far away. But daily survival lived gently beside the Nile. Inside the house, Tia cleaned the last of the cooking tools. Water was poured carefully into clay bowls. Leftover bread was wrapped for the morning. Fire embers were covered with ash to preserve heat for dawn. Everything prepared for repetition. Everything prepared for tomorrow. Hori finally stood and stepped back inside. The room was dim now, lit only by faint orange glow from the dying fire. His children were already asleep. Tia lay down quietly beside them. The home settled into silence. Outside, the Nile continued moving through the darkness, steady as always, carrying the reflection of stars across its surface. The village followed soon after. Fires faded. Voices disappeared. Movement slowed into stillness. And once again, ancient Egypt entered the quiet space between one day and the next. A space filled not with events, but with rest. And the promise that when the sun returned, so would bread, labor, and the endless simple meals that carried life forward along the river that never stopped flowing. The night over the Nile deepened into its quietest hours. This was the part of darkness when even distant sounds seemed to soften, as if the world itself was holding still. The river moved without noise, reflecting only faint starlight across its slow, steady surface. In the village, sleep covered every home. Mud brick walls held the warmth of the day for a while longer, but slowly even that warmth faded into the cool night air. Inside Hori's house, everything was still. Breathing. Rest. Silence. Only the faintest remnants of the evening fire remained beneath a layer of ash. Outside, reeds along the riverbank swayed gently in the wind. A few nightbirds called once, then disappeared again into the darkness. Time felt less important at night. There was no labor. No movement. No demand from fields or canals or boats. Only recovery. Hori slept deeply, as workers often did after long days of physical effort. The body, shaped by repetition and exhaustion, knew how to surrender to rest without resistance. In the distance, the Nile continued its quiet work. It carried water through Egypt's narrow green valley as it had for thousands of years, feeding fields, shaping soil, and allowing life to continue in a land otherwise surrounded by desert. Even at night, the river remained active in its own way. It was never truly separate from the lives along its banks. It was the reason those lives existed at all. Far from the village, a small group of fishermen still drifted along the water under faint lantern light. Their movements were slow and careful. The nets they carried slipped into the river with almost no sound, disappearing beneath the surface before being drawn back up again with patience and rhythm. Fishing at night required trust in the river. Trust in silence. Trust in repetition. Just like farming. Just like baking bread. Just like grinding grain. Everything in Egypt depended on returning patterns. Then, gradually, as always, the sky began to shift again. Not with urgency, but with patience. A faint line of light appeared at the horizon. The beginning of another morning. Inside the village homes, bodies began to stir before the sun had fully arrived. This was not a sudden awakening. It was a slow return. A quiet recognition that rest was ending and life was beginning again. Tia was the first to rise in Hori's home. She moved carefully so as not to disturb the sleeping children or her husband. Her hands immediately reached for familiar tasks. Fire. Water. Grain. The essentials of morning. A small glow returned to the hearth as dried reeds caught flame. Light spread gently across the interior walls. Outside, the first birds began calling again near the river. Their voices were soft but persistent, echoing across fields still wrapped in early mist. The Nile shimmered faintly beneath the new light. A few fishermen were already returning to shore, carrying baskets of fish caught during the night. Their silhouettes moved slowly along the riverbank paths, heading toward village markets or homes where early cooking had already begun. The cycle had started again. Hori woke soon after. His body felt the familiar heaviness of early morning, but it was no longer unfamiliar. It belonged to him, just as it belonged to every worker along the Nile. He sat up quietly and listened. The fire crackled softly nearby. His family breathed in sleep around him. Outside, morning life was beginning once more. There was no surprise in this moment. Only continuity. He ate a small piece of bread left from the previous day while Tia prepared the morning meal. Bread would again be central. It always was. Grain shaped nearly every part of Egyptian life. It was planted in fields, harvested by hand, stored in granaries, ground into flour, baked into bread, and consumed in almost every household every single day. Even the state depended on it. Workers were often paid in grain rations. Families measured wealth not only in land or tools, but in storage jars filled with barley or wheat. Without grain, nothing else could function. No labor. No trade. No construction. No stability. Food was not separate from life. It was life itself. As dawn fully arrived, the village once again filled with movement. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Water jars were lifted and carried toward the river. Grinding stones returned to their steady motion. Tools were gathered. Paths filled with footsteps heading toward fields, canals, and riverbanks. Hori stepped outside into the morning air. The Nile stretched before him, calm and wide beneath the soft light of sunrise. Somewhere along its banks, another day of fishing had already ended. Somewhere in the fields, farmers were already working the soil. Somewhere in the villages, bread was already being baked. Everything began again at once. Not in one place, but everywhere. And as Hori joined the flow of workers moving along the river paths, the same quiet truth returned, as it always did in ancient Egypt: life continued because food continued. Bread continued. Beer continued. Fish continued. Grain continued. And as long as the Nile flowed beside them, the ordinary meals of ordinary people would keep shaping each day slowly, steadily, endlessly under the same sun, along the same river, in a rhythm that never truly ended. The morning light spread fully across the Nile Valley. By now, the village was no longer half awake. It had returned completely to life, as if the night had only been a short pause between two breaths. Smoke rose in thin lines from dozens of cooking fires. The smell of baking bread filled the air again, mixing with the sharper scent of onions, the earthy smell of grain, and the faint dampness rising from the river after the cool night. Hori walked with other workers toward the day's labor site. Their steps followed the familiar paths carved by years of movement. Nothing about the road felt new anymore. The same dust. The same fields. The same river beside them. The same sky slowly brightening above Egypt. And yet, every day still felt necessary. Because every day required food. At the canal worksite, preparations had already begun. Men gathered tools. Baskets were stacked near the edge of the water. A few workers knelt briefly to adjust ropes or check wooden shovels. Before the heat arrived, there was always a short window of calm work. And before that work began, there was always food. Hori opened his bundle. Bread again. Simple, dense, slightly dry from the previous evening. He ate slowly while sitting near the canal bank. Nearby, Painasi shared a small portion of onions with another worker. The sharp smell cut through the morning air. Someone passed around a small jar of beer. Each man took a small drink before beginning labor. Not for pleasure, but for strength. In ancient Egypt, this pattern repeated constantly. Food first. Work second. Rest later. A cycle that shaped nearly every worker's life. As the sun climbed higher, the canal work resumed. Mud was lifted again. Water was guided again. Reeds were cleared again. The rhythm returned quickly, almost automatically, as if the body remembered it without needing instruction. Hori worked beside the canal edge, pulling wet earth into baskets and passing them along to be carried away. The labor felt familiar now in a way that almost removed thought. Only movement remained. Lift. Carry. Return. Repeat. Around him, other workers followed the same pattern. The sound of work blended into a steady background. Water moving. Mud shifting. Tools scraping earth. Occasional quiet voices calling instructions. Above them, the sun continued rising. By midday, it would become intense again, pressing heat across the entire landscape. But for now, the morning still held a small amount of softness. At the break, workers gathered again beneath shade cloths. Food appeared as it always did. Bread from home. Onions from small bundles. Dried fish shared among groups. Beer poured into rough clay cups. Hori ate beside Panisi, who sat quietly chewing slowly as he looked toward the canal. Same water, Panisi said after a long pause. Hori glanced at him. The older worker continued softly. Same river. Same work. Same food. There was no complaint in his voice. Only observation. Because in many ways, he was right. Life along the Nile changed slowly. Even generations could pass while daily routines remained nearly identical. Bread still came from grain. Beer still came from barley. Fish still came from the river. Onions and garlic still flavored meals the same way they had for centuries. And workers still labored beneath the same sun. The break ended, and the canal work resumed again. Afternoon arrived with its familiar weight. Heat settled heavily across the fields. Shadows shrank. Movement slowed. Sweat returned quickly as bodies continued working. Hori felt the strain in his arms as he lifted another basket of mud. The canal edge had become warmer now, the earth heated by sunlight and effort. But the work did not stop. It simply continued until completion. By late afternoon, the workers finally reached the final stages of clearing the section. Water began flowing more freely through the canal again, moving steadily toward the fields beyond. A quiet sense of completion spread through the group. Not celebration, but relief. The system was restored. Food production could continue. As the sun began lowering again, workers gathered their tools and prepared to return home. The walk back followed the same familiar paths as always. Fields on one side. River on the other. Villages ahead. And everywhere, signs of food preparation already beginning again. Smoke rising. Bread baking. Water being carried. Grain being ground. Hori walked slowly beside the others. His body felt tired, but not empty. Because even fatigue in this world was shaped by food. Everything returned to it. The village appeared ahead once more as evening light softened across the Nile. And just like every other day, the cycle waited patiently for them to return. Food would be prepared. Meals would be shared. Rest would follow. And tomorrow, the same river, the same sun, and the same simple meals would bring them forward again quietly, steadily, without end. Evening arrived again over the Nile Valley, the way it always did, slowly, without announcement, without disruption. The heat of the day softened into something gentler. The sky shifted from bright gold into deeper tones of orange and then quiet blue, as if the entire world was slowly lowering its voice. Hori and the other workers returned along the river path. Their movements were slower now. Not from confusion, but from exhaustion that had settled deep into the body after hours of steady labor. Dust clung to their clothing. Their skin carried the warmth of the sun even as the air around them began to cool. The Nile flowed beside them as they walked. Unchanging. Patient. Familiar. Ahead, the village was already preparing for night. Cooking fires were visible from a distance, small glowing points scattered among the mud brick homes. Smoke drifted upward in thin trails, carrying the smell of food across the evening air. Bread baking again. Beans boiling again. Fish roasting again. Onions and garlic softening in clay pots again. The same patterns returned without effort. Hori entered his home as the light outside began fading. Inside, Tia was already serving the evening meal. There was bread, slightly warm from being reheated near the fire. A pot of lentils simmered gently beside it. A small portion of fish remained from earlier preparations. Beer stood ready in a clay jar. The arrangement was simple, but complete. The children sat quietly near the floor, waiting. Hori lowered himself beside them, feeling the weight of the day finally release from his shoulders. He took the bread first. Every meal began the same way. Bread was always first. It was the center of everything. He dipped it into the lentils, letting it soften slightly before eating. The taste was familiar. Earthy grain. Warm beans. A faint bitterness from garlic. A soft saltiness from fish. Nothing surprising. Nothing new. And yet it was enough. Outside, night deepened further. Stars began appearing again above the river, scattered across the sky like small points of light. The village grew quieter with each passing moment. Voices softened. Movement slowed. Fires dimmed slightly as cooking ended and households prepared for rest. But even in this quiet, food remained present everywhere. Leftovers were stored carefully. Bread was wrapped for morning. Water jars were refilled. Grain baskets were checked one last time. Because food was never just consumed. It was managed. Protected. Preserved. Hori finished his meal slowly. The beer tasted thick and slightly sour, but it helped ease the tiredness in his body. He sat back against the wall afterward, letting the evening settle fully around him. The children were already sleepy. Tia cleaned the bowls quietly, pouring a small amount of water over them and setting them aside for tomorrow. Nothing was wasted. Not grain. Not water. Not food. Everything had purpose. Outside, the Nile continued flowing under the night sky. Its movement was silent but constant, shaping the land, feeding the fields, and connecting all the villages along its banks. Hori stepped outside for a short moment. The air felt cooler now. The heat of the day had finally released its hold. He looked out toward the river. In the distance, faint lantern lights from fishing boats moved slowly across the water. Life did not stop at night along the Nile. It only shifted. Some worked. Some rested. Some traveled. Some prepared food for the next day. The rhythm never truly ended. Hori sat near the doorway again, listening to the night. A quiet wind moved through the palm trees. Water brushed softly against the riverbank. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Above him, the stars remained steady. Ancient Egyptians often lived with the sky above them every night of their lives. It became part of their sense of time. Just like food. Just like the river. Just like labor. Everything repeated. Everything returned. Inside the home, his family slept now. The fire had nearly gone out, leaving only faint warmth in the ashes. Hori remained outside a little longer. Not thinking deeply. Not planning. Just existing in the quiet space between one day and the next. Tomorrow would bring bread again. Beer again. Labor again. Heat again. And the Nile would continue to flow beside it all, carrying life forward through Egypt's long, narrow valley. Slowly. Steadily. As it always had. The night reached its deepest quiet. This was the kind of silence that felt almost complete, as if the entire Nile Valley had paused its breath for a short while. Even the wind seemed to move more carefully now, slipping through palm leaves and reeds without disturbing the stillness. Hori finally returned inside. The home was dark except for the faintest warmth still lingering near the hearth. His family slept close together, their bodies resting in calm, steady breathing. He lay down beside them. And slowly, the weight of the day released. In ancient Egypt, sleep was not separate from daily life. It was part of the same rhythm. Labor. Food. Rest. Repeat. And now, rest had arrived again. Outside, the Nile continued its quiet movement through the darkness. It reflected faint starlight, carrying it gently downstream as if holding fragments of the sky within its surface. Far along the river, small fishing boats drifted slowly. Their lanterns flickered in the distance, barely visible, like tiny breathing lights moving across water. The fishermen worked carefully even at night. They knew the river's habits well. Where fish gathered. Where currents slowed. Where nets should be placed and when they should be pulled. Fishing was not rushed. It required patience shaped by years of repetition. Just like farming. Just like baking bread. Just like grinding grain before sunrise. Everything in Egypt depended on learning patterns and repeating them until they became part of the body. Time passed slowly. Then, once again, the sky began to change. Not dramatically. Not suddenly. But gently. A faint line of light appeared at the horizon. The beginning of another morning. Inside the village homes, sleep slowly loosened its hold. The shift from night to day in ancient Egypt was not a sharp break. It was gradual. A soft return. Hori stirred first, as he often did. His body recognized the change in light even before his mind fully awoke. He opened his eyes and listened. Fire crackling faintly. Birds beginning to call. Distant movement near the river. A quiet awareness that another cycle was beginning. Tia was already moving near the hearth. She added reeds carefully, bringing back a small flame. The familiar glow returned to the room. Morning had come again. And with it, food preparation would begin once more. Bread would be shaped. Grain would be ground. Beer would be poured. Water would be fetched from the Nile. Everything would restart in the same order it always had. Hori sat up slowly. His muscles felt the memory of yesterday's labor, but it no longer surprised him. This feeling was normal. It belonged to life. He took a small piece of bread left from the previous day and ate it quietly while watching the light grow stronger outside the doorway. The village was waking again. Smoke rising. Voices returning. Footsteps on packed earth. Grinding stones beginning their steady sound once more. The Nile reflected early light across its surface. Soft. Pale. Familiar. Farmers were already heading toward fields. Fishermen prepared nets again along the riverbanks. Workers gathered tools for canal repair, construction, and maintenance. And everywhere, food was already being prepared. Because nothing in this world could begin without it. Bread was always the first step. It had been that way for as long as anyone could remember. Hori stepped outside into the morning air. The river stretched before him once again, unchanged and steady beneath the brightening sky. Another day had arrived. And like every day before it, and every day that would follow, it began with the same simple foundation: food from grain. Water from the Nile. Labor beneath the sun. And lives quietly continuing along the river that never stopped flowing. The morning had fully settled now. Light spread evenly across the Nile Valley, touching every path, field, and rooftop with a calm brightness that felt steady rather than sharp. The air was still cool, but it would not stay that way for long. It never did. Hori walked again with the flow of workers moving toward the fields and canals. By now, the movement of the village felt almost like a single body. People rose together, worked together, rested together, and returned together. Not in perfect coordination, but in shared rhythm shaped by necessity. Ahead, the irrigation channels shimmered faintly under the morning sun. Water moved through them slowly, feeding the fields that stretched outward in long green rows. Every channel mattered. Every section of flow had purpose. If one part failed, the surrounding land would feel it quickly. That was always the quiet pressure beneath Egyptian life. Everything depended on maintenance. Not just of tools or canals, but of food itself. Hori reached the work site and paused for a moment before beginning. The canal looked similar to the day before, but water levels had shifted slightly overnight. Small changes always appeared after the Nile's subtle movements. Nothing remained exactly the same for long. Workers gathered nearby. Tools were distributed. Simple instructions were exchanged. And then, as always, the work began without ceremony. Mud was lifted. Reeds were cleared. Water flow was adjusted. Earth was reshaped by hand. The sound of labor returned to the landscape. Not loud, but constant. Hori worked beside others in steady repetition. His hands moved without hesitation now. The body had learned what to do long before thought became necessary. Lift. Place. Return. Repeat. Around him, other workers followed the same rhythm. Some spoke occasionally, but most conserved their energy for movement. The morning passed in this slow pattern. And as it did, the sun rose higher again, turning the cool air gradually warmer. By the time midday approached, the familiar heaviness returned to the landscape. Heat spread across the fields. Shadows shortened. Breathing became slightly slower. Movement required more effort. But the work did not stop. It paused only briefly, as it always did. Food appeared again at the break. Bread wrapped in cloth. Onions tied in small bundles. Beer stored in clay jars cooled in the shade. Hori sat with Panisi once more. The older worker chewed slowly, looking toward the canal with a quiet expression. "It never changes," Panisi said softly. Hori did not answer immediately. Because in a way, there was nothing to correct. The cycle was real. But it was not empty. It was what allowed everything else to exist. Without repetition, there would be no harvest. Without harvest, no bread. Without bread, no labor. Without labor, no village. The system was simple and complete. They drank a little beer, ate a little bread, and returned to work. The afternoon passed in steady labor once again. Heat, mud, water, movement. Until finally, the light began to soften again at the edge of the sky. Evening arrived like it always did. Not suddenly, but gently. The workers finished their final adjustments to the canal and gathered their tools. Water now flowed more smoothly through the system, reaching deeper into the fields. A quiet sense of completion returned again. Not celebration. Just continuation made possible. They walked back toward the village together. The Nile accompanied them as it always did, reflecting the changing colors of the sky. Smoke was already visible ahead. Cooking fires returning. Meals being prepared. Homes coming back to life after another day of labor. Hori thought briefly of food as he walked. Not in hunger, but in recognition. Because food was always close to thought in this world. It defined the beginning and end of every day. Inside his home, Tia was already cooking. Bread baking again. Lentils simmering again. A small portion of fish being prepared again when available. Garlic and onions filling the air again with their familiar scent. Hori stepped inside as the meal was ready. The family gathered quietly. They ate without hurry. No part of the meal was unusual anymore. And that was what made it comforting. Everything known. Everything expected. Everything steady. Outside, night slowly approached once more. And the Nile continued flowing beside the village, carrying its silent promise forward. Tomorrow would come the same way today had come. With bread. With labor. With rest. And with the quiet, endless rhythm of ordinary lives sustained by the simplest food along the river that never stopped moving. Night settled again over the Nile Valley with the same quiet certainty it always carried. The last traces of daylight disappeared behind the desert horizon, leaving the sky deep and wide above the river. Stars returned slowly, one by one, as if the darkness itself was remembering how to hold them. Inside the village, life softened. Cooking fires dimmed. Voices lowered. Doors closed gently. Homes turned inward toward rest. Hori sat outside for a while longer, as he often did after the evening meal. The air felt cooler now, carrying the faint moisture of the river. Somewhere nearby, reeds moved softly in the wind. The Nile itself flowed without sound, a constant presence just beyond the village edge. Inside his home, his family was already resting. The day had been long, but not unusual. No day in his life had ever truly broken the pattern. Work. Food. Rest. Work again. That was the structure of everything. And within that structure, there was a strange kind of stability. Hori finally stepped inside and lay down beside his family. The room was dark, lit only by faint warmth still held in the earth and walls. Sleep came slowly at first. Then gently. Then completely. Outside, the Nile continued its movement through the night. Fishermen drifted far along its surface, their small lanterns flickering like quiet stars reflected on water. Nets entered the river and were drawn back out in steady rhythm. Even at night, food was being gathered. Because food never truly stopped being needed. Not in Egypt. Not anywhere along the river. Time passed. The night deepened. And once again, without urgency or warning, the sky began to shift. A pale line of light returned at the horizon. Morning was coming. The same morning that had come every day before it. Inside the village, the return to life began again in small steps. A fire stirred. A door opened. Water moved in clay jars. A grinding stone began its steady sound. Tia rose quietly first, as she always did. Her movements were familiar now, almost automatic. Fire. Grain. Bread. These were the first tasks of every morning. Without them, nothing else could follow. Hori woke soon after. His body recognized the change before his thoughts fully formed it. He sat up slowly, listening to the sounds of early morning returning. Birds near the river. Soft movement in nearby homes. The faint crackle of fire. The beginning of another day. He ate a small piece of bread from the previous evening while watching light spread across the doorway. The taste was simple. Dry grain softened slightly with time. But it was enough to begin the day. Outside, the village was already moving. Smoke rising from cooking fires. Footsteps on dirt paths. Grinding stones returning to motion. Voices calling softly between homes. The Nile reflected early light in long, calm lines across its surface. Fishermen were already preparing boats again. Farmers were walking toward fields again. Workers were gathering tools again. And everywhere, food preparation was already underway again. Bread being shaped. Beer being poured. Onions being peeled. Grain being measured. The same beginning. The same order. The same life continuing forward along the river. Hori stepped outside into the morning air. The Nile stretched before him, wide and steady beneath the growing sun. Another day had arrived. And as always, it began the only way it ever had, with food from the land and river. With labor beneath the sun. With families sharing simple meals. And with the quiet, endless rhythm of life continuing along the water that never stopped flowing. The morning sun rose higher over the Nile Valley, and with it, the village fully awakened once again. What had begun as quiet movement in the early hours now became steady activity across every path and home. Smoke from cooking fires thickened slightly in the warm air, carrying the familiar scent of grain, garlic, and baked bread across the settlement. Hori walked toward the canal worksite again with the other laborers. There was no need for instruction anymore. The body already knew where to go. The path beside the river felt unchanged, as it always did. Fields on one side, water on the other, and beyond them the distant edge of desert waiting silently at the horizon. Egypt existed in this narrow balance. Between water and sand. Between growth and emptiness. Between abundance and need. At the canal, work began without delay. Mud, reeds, and water waited as they always did. Hori bent down and lifted the first basket of earth. The motion felt familiar, almost comforting in its repetition. Around him, the same rhythm resumed across the site. Lift. Carry. Clear. Return. Not spoken. Just lived. As the morning progressed, the sun grew stronger, and the canal area slowly warmed under its light. Workers adjusted their pace without needing to discuss it. Everyone understood the changing heat instinctively. Food came again when the time arrived. It always came at the same point in the day. Bread wrapped in cloth. Onions shared in small pieces. Beer poured into rough cups. Sometimes dried fish or leftover beans if the household had them. Hori sat near Panisi again during the break. The older worker chewed slowly, looking toward the water as if watching something far beyond it. Same hands, Painassi said after a while. Hori glanced at him. Same river, he continued. Same bread. Same work. There was no sadness in the words. Only quiet observation of repetition. Because repetition was not unusual here. It was expected. The break ended, and the workers returned to the canal. Afternoon heat arrived once more, pressing down across the valley. The earth grew warmer. The air grew still. The work grew heavier. But it continued. As it always did. Mud was moved. Water was guided. Canal flow was restored little by little. And beneath it all, food remained the quiet force that made every movement possible. Without it, none of this would continue. By late afternoon, the work reached its final stage again. Water moved more freely now through the cleared section of canal, feeding into fields that stretched beyond sight. A soft sense of completion returned to the group. Not excitement. Just the quiet understanding that today's labor had fulfilled its purpose. The tools were gathered. The workers stood. And the walk back to the village began once more. The Nile flowed beside them. Unchanging. Present. Constant. As evening approached, the village appeared again ahead of them, already alive with smoke and preparation. Cooking fires were lit. Bread was baking. Water was being carried. Meals were being arranged inside homes. Hori walked slowly, feeling the tiredness of the day settle into his body. But it was not empty tiredness. It was the kind that followed food, labor, and completion. The kind that meant the day had been lived fully. Inside his home, Tia was already preparing the evening meal again. The same elements returned. Bread. Grain. Lentils. Onions. Beer. Occasionally fish from the river when available. Hori entered as the food was ready. The family gathered again. They ate together quietly. No part of the meal was new. But nothing needed to be new. What mattered was that it was there. Enough to end hunger. Enough to restore strength. Enough to carry them into the next day. Outside, night began to return again over the Nile. And once more, the cycle held the village gently in its rhythm. Food before labor. Labor before rest. Rest before food again. The river flowing beside it all without pause. Carrying life forward. Slowly. Quietly. Endlessly. Night returned to the Nile Valley the same way it always did, without sound, without urgency, and without change. The village slowly dimmed into darkness again. One by one, cooking fires settled into glowing embers. The last voices faded. Doors closed gently. The movement of the day dissolved into stillness. Only the river remained in motion. The Nile continued flowing beside the sleeping village, carrying faint reflections of starlight across its surface. It moved as it had moved long before any of the homes along its banks had been built. Hori was already asleep inside his home. His body rested deeply now, shaped by repetition, labor, and simple meals that had filled his day from morning to evening. Beside him, his family slept in quiet closeness. There was no distance between their lives and the rhythm of the village outside. Everything followed the same pattern. Work. Food. Rest. Return. And again. And again. Outside, the night deepened further. Far along the river, faint lanterns drifted slowly across the water. Fishermen continued their quiet work even in darkness, casting nets into places they knew by memory rather than sight. Their movements were careful. Practiced. Patient. because the river rewarded patience more than force. Time passed gently through the night. And as always, before the world fully rested, something subtle began to change. The sky at the edge of the horizon grew faintly lighter. Not enough to wake the world immediately, but enough to signal what was coming. Morning again. Inside the village, sleep loosened its hold in slow stages. A hand moved slightly in the dark. A fire was prepared before being fully lit. A jar of water was lifted carefully from its place. A door shifted open without sound. The return began before sunrise. Tia rose again first, as she always did. Her movements were familiar, steady, unspoken. Fire. Grain. Bread. The beginning of every day. Hori woke not long after, his awareness rising with the change in light and sound. He did not need to think about what would happen next. He already knew. That knowledge was part of living here. He sat up and listened to the morning return. Birds calling near the river. Smoke beginning to rise. The faint sound of grinding stone. Footsteps already moving along the village paths. He ate a small piece of bread left from the previous evening. It was simple. Dry grain softened slightly by time. But it was enough. It always was. Outside, the Nile reflected early light again, calm and steady beneath the growing sun. The village was already alive. Farmers heading to fields. Fishermen preparing nets. Workers gathering tools. Women beginning bread preparation. Children moving between homes with small tasks. And everywhere, food was already part of the beginning. Not as reward, but as necessity. Bread prepared for the day ahead. Beer stored for labor. Onions and grain measured carefully for meals. Fish preserved or freshly caught from the river. Everything started with food. Everything returned to food. Hori stepped outside into the morning air once more. The river stretched beside him, unchanged. And ahead of him, another day was already forming. Not different from the last. Not separate from the next. Just another quiet continuation of life along the Nile. With bread. With labor. With rest. And with the endless, steady rhythm of ordinary people living beside a river that never stopped flowing. The morning had fully settled over the Nile Valley now, gentle and familiar, as if it had always been there and would always remain. Light spread evenly across the fields, touching the green crops, the narrow canals, and the mud brick homes with a soft warmth that slowly replaced the coolness of night. The village was awake again. Not suddenly, but in layers. Hori walked with the other workers along the same river path, the same dust underfoot, the same water flowing beside them. Nothing about the route had changed. And yet every morning it felt newly necessary. Ahead, the fields were already active. Farmers guided oxen through soil that had been softened by the Nile's careful reach. The animals moved slowly, pulling wooden plows that carved lines into the earth in long, steady strokes. Behind them, seeds would be placed. Then covered. Then watered. Then waited upon. That was the entire cycle of farming. Not rushed. Not forced. Just repeated with patience shaped by generations. Hori paused briefly at the edge of a canal before beginning work. The water reflected the sky in pale, shifting patterns. Small ripples moved across its surface whenever a breeze passed through the reeds. It looked peaceful. But it required constant attention. Without workers maintaining its flow, even a single canal could become blocked, and the surrounding fields would begin to suffer quietly. That was how survival worked here. not through one moment of effort, but through endless maintenance. The workers gathered, tools were distributed, and the day's labor began again. Mud was lifted from the canal bed. Reeds were cut and cleared. Water channels were adjusted by hand. Earth was reshaped with slow, practiced motion. Everything moved in repetition. Lift. Carry. Return. Around Hori, the sounds of work formed a steady background. Water splashing softly. Wood scraping against earth. Occasional short instructions between workers. And above it all, the rising sun. By midday, heat arrived again, pressing down across the valley. The air became still. The shadows shrank. Movement slowed slightly, though it never stopped. Workers continued in silence, conserving energy. Because they knew what would come next. The break. And food. It arrived as it always did. Bread wrapped in cloth. Onions shared in small portions. Beer poured into clay cups. Sometimes dried fish or beans, depending on what the household had stored. Hori sat beneath shade with Panasi and a few others. They ate without hurry. Bread first, as always. Panasi broke his piece carefully and spoke quietly without looking up. People think food is simple, he said. Hori listened. But it is not simple, Panasi continued. It is the reason we wake up. The reason we stay here. The reason anything continues. Hori did not disagree. Because it was true in a way that did not need explanation. Food was not just part of life. It was the structure underneath it. The break ended slowly. And once again, the canal work resumed. Afternoon heat deepened. The earth grew warmer beneath their hands. Sweat mixed with dust as labor continued in steady rhythm. Time passed not in moments, but in repetition. Then, as always, the light began to shift again. Evening returned. Softly. Without warning. Work slowed. Tools were gathered. The canal section was once again functional, water flowing steadily into the fields that depended on it. Another part of the system had been maintained. Another day had been completed. The workers walked back toward the village. The Nile moved beside them, reflecting the colors of the setting sun. Ahead, smoke was already rising. Evening meals were being prepared once again. Inside homes, fires burned gently. Bread was baking. Lentils were simmering. Onions were being cooked. Beer was being poured into shared cups. Hori entered his home as night approached. Tia was already serving food. The family gathered quietly. They ate as they always did. Not quickly. Not slowly. Just steadily. Bread softened in lentils. Fish carried faint salt from the river. Onions added sharpness to each bite. Beer eased the tiredness of the day. Outside, darkness returned once more over the Nile Valley. And with it came the same silence. The same river. The same stars. The same cycle waiting beneath everything. Hori stepped outside after eating. The air was cool again. He looked toward the water. The Nile continued flowing through the night as it always had. And in its movement, it carried everything forward. Fields. Villages. Workers. Meals. Days. All connected. All repeating. All quietly sustained by the simple, ordinary act of food shared every single day along the river that never stopped. The night over the Nile Valley grew deeper, but it never felt empty. It felt full in a quiet way. Full of breath. full of rest, full of the slow presence of a world that never truly stopped moving, even when people slept. Hori had returned inside after sitting briefly beneath the night sky. Now he lay beside his family again, listening to the faint sounds of the village settling completely into sleep. The last cooking fires had gone dark. Only small points of warmth remained in a few homes where embers were carefully preserved for morning. Outside, the Nile continued its steady movement. It did not rush. It did not pause. It simply flowed through Egypt's long green valley, carrying reflections of stars across its surface like scattered light. Far downriver, faint lanterns still drifted. Fishermen worked slowly through the night, their movements shaped by memory and patience. Nets entered the water, disappeared, then returned again with quiet certainty. Fish would become morning food. Just as grain would become bread. Just as morning would become labor. Just as every day became the next. Time in ancient Egypt did not feel broken into separate pieces. It felt continuous. Like water itself. The sky at the edge of the horizon began to lighten once more. A familiar signal. Not urgent. Not loud. Just the return of another cycle. Inside the village, movement began again in soft stages. A hand reaching for a jar. A fire being stirred. A door opening slightly. A quiet step across packed earth. Tia rose again before full sunrise. Her routine never changed. Fire. Grain. Bread. The foundation of every morning. The flame returned in the hearth, weak at first, then steady. Light filled the room slowly. Hori woke not long after, already familiar with the rhythm of waking before thought fully arrived. He sat quietly for a moment. Listening. Birds near the river beginning their calls again. Water shifting softly along the Nile's edge. Smoke rising from early cooking fires in nearby homes. The faint sound of grinding stone returning once more. The village was waking again. Not as a sudden event. But as something natural. Something expected. Something that belonged to life itself. Hori ate a small piece of bread from the previous evening. It was simple. Dry. Familiar. It carried no surprise, continuity. Outside, morning light spread across the valley once more. The Nile reflected it gently, as it always did. The river did not change with the days. It only moved forward. Farmers were already walking toward fields again. Fishermen were already preparing nets again. Workers were already gathering tools again. And everywhere, food preparation had already begun again. Bread being shaped. Grain being measured. Beer being poured. Onions being peeled. Everything starting from the same point. Food. Then movement. Then labor. Then rest. Hori stepped outside into the morning air. The river stretched beside him, wide and steady beneath the rising sun. Another day had begun. And like every day before it, and every day still to come, it unfolded the same way, with bread in the morning. With work beneath the sun. With food shared again at midday and evening. And with the quiet, endless rhythm of ordinary lives sustained along a river that never stopped flowing. Morning settled gently across the Nile Valley once more, the way it all, as if the world had learned this rhythm long ago and never needed to change it again. The light grew warmer, spreading slowly over the fields, the canals, and the village paths. Everything felt familiar in the soft brightness of early day. Hori walked with the workers again, following the river's edge. The ground beneath them was the same as yesterday. Dust in the same places. Fields in the same order. Water moving in the same direction. Even the air felt like it remembered what it had been doing before sunrise. Ahead, the canal worksite was already waiting. Nothing about it had changed overnight. And nothing needed to. The Nile itself had already done most of the work by simply continuing to flow. Workers gathered again. Tools were lifted again. And the day began again. Mud was moved. Reeds were cut. Water was guided. Earth was reshaped. The canal, like everything else in Egypt, required constant attention, not because it failed quickly, but because time itself slowly shifted everything out of place. Hori worked without speaking much. His body moved in familiar patterns now, shaped by repetition more than instruction. Lift. Carry. Clear. Return. Around him, others did the same. The sound of labor filled the morning air in a steady, unbroken rhythm. Water splashing. Wood scraping. Soft voices giving brief directions. The occasional pause, then movement again. Above them, the sun continued its rise. And as it rose higher, the heat returned. Not sudden, but inevitable. By midday, the familiar heaviness of warmth pressed down across the valley again. Shadows shrank. Air stillness returned. Movement slowed slightly but did not stop. The workers understood this without needing words. They adjusted naturally. And soon, the break arrived again. Food returned again. Bread wrapped in cloth. Onions shared by hand. Beer poured into clay cups. Occasionally dried fish or beans, depending on what each household could provide. Hori sat with Panasi again beneath a small shade. They ate quietly for a while. Then Panasi spoke in a low voice, almost like thinking aloud. "Some days feel long," he said. Hori nodded slightly. "But they are all the same day," Panasi continued. There was no sadness in his tone. Only recognition. Because in the world they lived in, sameness was not a problem. It was stability. It meant the river was still flowing. It meant the fields could still grow. It meant bread would still exist tomorrow. The break ended. And once again, the canal work resumed. Afternoon passed in steady labor. Heat. Mud. Water. Repetition. Time moved forward not through change, but through continuation. And slowly, the light shifted again. Evening returned. Softly. As it always did. Work gradually ended. Tools were gathered. Water flowed more freely through the canal once more, reaching the fields beyond it. Another section of the system had been maintained. Another part of Egypt had been kept alive. The workers began walking back toward the village. The Nile moved beside them, reflecting the deepening colors of sunset. Ahead, smoke rose again from cooking fires. Homes were already preparing for night. Inside the village, food was already being made again. Bread baking. Lentils cooking. Onions softening. Beer poured into shared vessels. Hori entered his home as darkness approached. Tia was already serving the evening meal. The family gathered again. They ate again. Bread first. Then lentils. Then fish when available. Then beer to end the day. Simple food. Repeated food. Familiar food. Outside, night returned once more over the Nile Valley. Stars appeared again. The river continued flowing again. And the world settled again into its quiet rhythm. Hori stepped outside for a moment after eating. The air was cool. The village was quieting. The day was ending exactly as it had ended before. And would end again. He looked toward the river. And understood, without needing words, that life here was not made of single moments. It was made of repeating ones. Bread. Work. Rest. River. Over and over. And in that repetition, the world continued to exist steady, simple, and endlessly sustained along the Nile that never stopped flowing. Next part 25. The night had fully settled again over the Nile Valley, and everything that moved during the day now rested in quiet stillness. The village was dark, but not empty. It was full in a softer way, full of sleep, full of recovery, full of the slow rhythm of bodies restoring themselves after another day of labor and food and repetition. Hori lay inside his home, breathing slowly in the dark. Beside him, his family slept without movement. Outside, the Nile continued its steady journey through Egypt, carrying the reflection of stars across its surface like faint fragments of light stretched into water. Nothing rushed. Nothing broke. Everything simply continued. Far away along the river, fishermen still worked through the night. Their lanterns moved gently across the water, appearing and disappearing behind reeds and bends in the river. Nets entered the Nile and came back again in quiet cycles, bringing food for the morning markets. Even in darkness, food was being prepared. Because in this world, food was never only a daytime matter. It was constant. Always forming. Always being gathered. Always being shared. Time passed without interruption. And slowly, the sky began to change again. Not noticeably at first. Just a thin fading at the edge of the horizon. A sign that night was loosening its hold. Inside the village, the return began again in the smallest movements. A hand shifting a blanket. A door opening quietly. A small glow returning to a hearth. Water being lifted carefully from a jar. Tea arose again before sunrise. Her routine had become something deeper than habit. It was structure. Fire. Grain. Bread. The same beginning every day. The flame in the hearth came back slowly, then steadied. Light spread across the interior of the home. Hori woke soon after, as he always did, feeling the change in the air before fully opening his eyes. He listened first. Birds calling near the river. Soft movement in nearby homes. The faint return of grinding stones. Smoke beginning to rise into the early sky. The village was waking again. As it always had. As it always would. He ate a small piece of bread from the previous day. Nothing more was needed. Outside, the Nile reflected the first full light of morning again. The river looked unchanged. But it was always changing in small ways, just like everything else. Farmers were already moving toward the fields. Fishermen were already preparing nets again. Workers were already gathering tools again. And everywhere, food was already being prepared again. Bread forming in hands. Grain being measured. Beer being poured into clay jars. Onions being peeled beside morning fires. Everything beginning at the same point. Food. Then movement. Then labor. Then rest. Hori stepped outside into the morning air. The Nile stretched wide before him once more, steady beneath the rising sun. And as he joined the flow of workers moving along its edge, the same truth returned again, quiet, simple, and unchanging. Life here was not made of rare moments. It was made of repeating ones. Bread shared in the morning. Work beneath the sun. Food again at midday and evening. Sleep beneath the stars. And the river beside it all, never stopping, never rushing, always carrying everything forward in its slow, endless rhythm. And the village settled into its final quiet of the night. Not an ending that felt sharp or sudden, but one that arrived the same way every night did along the Nile, slowly, gently, as if the world was simply lowering its voice until nothing more needed to be said. Hori lay inside his home, breathing in the darkness. His family slept beside him, close enough that their presence could be felt even in silence. The faint warmth of the day still lingered in the walls, but it would not last long. Night always took it back. Outside, the river continued flowing. It did not change for endings. It did not pause for beginnings. It only moved forward, carrying the same water past the same fields, past the same villages, past the same lives that rose and fell along its banks. Somewhere far away, fishermen still drifted through the dark water, their lanterns small and steady. Nets entered the Nile, and returned again, bringing food that would become tomorrow's meals. Even now, even here, food continued its quiet work. Not as celebration. Not as event. But as continuation. The sky above the horizon began to soften. A faint light returning again, as it always did. Not to mark anything final. Only to continue the pattern. Inside the village, small movements began once more, gentle and familiar. A fire stirred. A door shifted. A hand reached for grain. And in that quiet return, nothing felt like an ending at all. Because in this place, nothing truly ended. It only changed its form. Bread became strength. Work became survival. Rest became tomorrow. Hori remained still for a long time, listening to the faint sounds of the village breathing around him. Then, slowly, even those sounds faded. Sleep took him again, softly, completely. And the Nile continued on. Not finishing. Not concluding. Just flowing. Endlessly.